General Manager Steve and Amy, volume all the way down and then mute the speaker. We have overhead speaker microphone.
Oh, yeah.
Because we'll get that.
All right. Would you like me to read the Zoom guidelines before we get started? I lost sound all of a sudden. For those of you following along at home. Karen,
I'd like to call the June 26th Water Resource Advisory Board meeting to order. And before I begin on any of the agenda items for today, I would like to have Joanna review the meeting protocols for the public members.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? I just lost
Joanna,
sound for a second.
We're not able to hear you.
I know. No?
Oh, Joanna.
Can you hear me okay? I lost your.
Let's see.
Can you hear me now? I can hear you.
Okay.
Hang on. How about now? No? Oh, Stephen can hear me on Rab. Sorry. Thank you, Stephen, for letting me know. Thank you, everyone, for waiting for just one moment while we get our sound ready. Karen, can you hear me? No? Okay. Here's what I'm going to do. For those of you online on Zoom that can hear me, I'm going to leave and come back. I'm not sure if it's my computer or not. But just so you know, that's what I'm doing, and I'll be back in just a moment. And so hopefully that will fix things. If not, they'll have to do something with the room audio. So I'll be right back. Hello, I am back. I'm not sure if you all can hear me, but I cannot hear you on Zoom. No? We are so, thank you so much, Stephen. It's really helpful that you keep chiming in. Stephen can hear me. Stephen, can you hear the board? Okay. I can see on my screen, for those of you who can hear me on Zoom, that it looks like the room is trying to connect to audio. So hang in there 1 second and we'll see if the room can get going. Thanks for the thumbs up, whoever is thumbs upping me. Hmm. For all of you there on Zoom, I know the RAB secretary is trying to fix it. I keep getting Teams chat, so hang in there for just a moment. Appreciate you being patient.
Okay, so
Oh, it's working.
somebody else has. Okay. gotcha.
That's taken
You
care
hear me
of.
now?
Would you say
Sound down.
Oh,
Are you good?
that's working for us.
Okay,
On
Now,
Zoom.
Joanna.
Now?
but there are folks who cannot get into the meeting.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Testing. Testing. No?
I hear you, Joanna. Can
Oh,
you
you
hear us?
can? I didn't want to keep asking because I wasn't totally sure. If you want to make me host, Karen, I can try to make the other people co-hosts and things. I know you've got a lot going on. Stephen Groders, you have been our sound check. Can you hear everybody okay? Great. Stephen replied affirmatively. So thanks so much for sitting through the technical difficulty. I know this room is normally pretty good, but it's never perfect. If it's all right with you, I'll go ahead and read the Zoom guidance and get started. Does that work?
Thank you,
Fantastic.
Joanna.
Some of us are still having difficulty joining by video.
Okay. Oh, you know what it is? Hang on just 1 second. Let's do this. Amy, you should be good to go. John, you should be good to go now. Just make sure that's everybody.
Joanna, Kevin Clark. You should be also co-host.
Sounds good. Let me upgrade Kevin. Let me read this and then I will for sure get Kevin all set. Okay, does that work? And then that
Sounds
way,
great.
a few minutes and stuff while I. But thank you, and please put any other names in the chat that need to be promoted to panelists, and I can take care of that. Okay, so thank you so much. And let me just read the Zoom guidance real quick and I will hand it over. My name is Joanna Bloom and I'm serving as the technical host for this meeting. Well, Karen is going to share
Trying to share.
slides, potentially, that
Sure.
basically cover what I'm going to say. So don't worry about the slides if they don't show up. But we
Second
put
one, right?
to find a balance between transparency with community members and security that minimizes disruptions. If you are here as a member of the public to speak, we'll need a full name associated with each person's participation in open and public comment, and we cannot unmute you without it. If your full name is not currently displayed, you can change it or send me a text, and I'll give you my cell phone number in just a moment. And I'm happy to change it for you. And sometimes I have to promote you to panelist or co-host or whatever. So I'll work through that as we go. There's no chat feature for this meeting, but the Q&A function is enabled so you can address any Zoom connectivity issues. And unfortunately, I can't answer any content questions. My role as Zoom host is really to just deal with Zoom and anything computer technology wise, but I won't be able to answer any of the other questions. But please use the Q&A function if you have questions on that front. My cell phone number, should you need to contact me, is 303-817-1742. You may be unable to control audio or video features until I promote you. Video is limited to city officials, employees, and invited speakers only. I'll unmute you when you're recognized to speak. And if you're on the phone, *6 allows you to unmute, and *9 raises your hand. It does the virtual raise hand function. And then when you're ready to speak for open comment, you may use the raise hand function. I'll call your name when it's your turn to speak and announce the name of the next speaker on deck. And you'll be given a 3-minute time period to speak. And we'll show that on a clock once you begin your comments. Thanks so much for being here. All right, and those are my guidelines, and I'll pass it off.
Thank you, Joanna. With that, then why don't we open the next agenda item, which is open public comment.
So if there are folks that are here to speak, go ahead and use the raise hand function. And I'll give you just a second to do that. Find the button on your computer, or again, it is *9 if you're on the phone. So far, we do have one member of the public ready to comment. Kathy Joyner is here. Kathy, you should be able to unmute and share your comments.
Thank you. My name is Kathy Joyner, and I'm a member of the South Boulder Creek Action Group. I've spoken before this board numerous times over the past 10 years, and I appreciate this opportunity tonight. I've had a chance to review the 2 information items in your packet tonight, and I'd like to express my support for the use of the project prioritization framework in determining which projects will provide the greatest benefits to the city. I also support the incorporation of this information into the CIP planning efforts. As you know, this prioritization tool was included as a part of the Comprehensive Flood and Stormwater Master Plan adopted by Council in 2022. It was also supported by this board and the CFS Community Working Group. Prioritization criteria used include life safety, project effectiveness, equity, and several other important gauges. I am particularly interested in these 3 criteria because they mesh well with the city's fundamental responsibility for the safety and welfare of its citizens. I lived in a neighborhood in 2013 that was severely impacted by South Boulder Creek flooding. After witnessing firsthand the devastation of unchecked floodwater, I was very happy to find that the South Boulder Creek Flood Mitigation Project scored far and away the highest for life safety criterion when compared to all other projects. In fact, that project, the South Boulder Creek Flood Mitigation Project, received the highest score of all projects evaluated, and we support this objective conclusion. Not only would this project remove thousands of residents from high hazard areas, it would also protect US 36, ensuring that it would remain open as a viable thoroughfare during flood events, something that was a significant problem in 2013. I urge you to support the results of these project prioritization efforts, as well as the incorporation of this information into the CIP in your recommendations to Council next month. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Kathy. Are there any other
Thanks
public
so much.
comments?
I don't see any other hands raised.
Let's just give it a moment until
Is there other people who are trying to raise their hand?
So where's this person? Okay, Joanna, we have somebody who said they're trying to call into the meeting and they're having trouble calling in. Deanne Johnson.
You raise your hand, question mark.
I'm looking for that right now, and there's actually 2 folks that have just raised their hands, so I'll go ahead and call on those, and then Karen, I'll maybe chat with you about the phone number and try to troubleshoot that.
Thank you.
So I first see Lynn Siegel, followed by Laura Tyler with their hands raised. And Lynn, you should be able to speak now.
Yeah, the problem here, and tell me instantly if you have any problem with my audio.
Thank you. Well,
Is CU South. This development goes far beyond any issues that Kathy Joyner has with South Boulder Creek. Ultimately, with the kind of flooding that we can get with the extra built environment from a second CU campus, as Gilbert White always said, it's not the people that die from drowning, they get hit from debris from the built environment, and the massive diversion of the alluvium will take out, Kathy, it will take out the water treatment plant. And that doesn't really give you priority at South Boulder Creek, does it? Because the whole city of Boulder will have no drinking water at that point. So these kind of issues are something that RAB has to stand up for on the highest issue of anyone. You can live without food for a couple weeks, but you can't live or for longer, for a month or like 3 months maybe, but you can't live without water for like 3 weeks. So we need to protect the water sources of our citizenry and the threat to that source of the built environment. That's what causes the problem. And I'm stating this, no, I don't mean to insult you. I'm stating this at the risk of stating the obvious. You all know this, but I want to see something on the part of the board members that acknowledges it and does something about it, because this is just not sustainable. Sorry about that. Let's see. I don't know exactly what Joe Tadeucci was talking about today in his hotline message, but as to the flooding potential around Alpine Balsam, of course that needs diversion. That, the North Boulder Park used to be a lake. So there, this is just, it's just like the 2013 flood. It was not that we had this deluge of rain like we did in Thompson, in the Big Thompson. It's like we had this slow rain for weeks, and we can have things we can't even predict that are going to consume, that get flooded, that, the land can only absorb so much, and then it's just over and inundated, and we're in a huge troublesome situation for major flooding in this area. We can't be building like this. Thank you. Done.
Thank you, Lynn.
thanks so much. We do have Laura Tyler who also wants to speak. And before I unmute you, Laura, I do just want to say out loud, if folks are hearing that people are having trouble joining the meeting, I'm happy to troubleshoot through my cell phone if they want to call or text at 303-817-1742. I just want to make sure we get everybody in here who would like to be here. Laura, I am going to unmute you now and you should be able to talk.
Hi, thanks for this opportunity to speak, and thank you, Joanna, for troubleshooting. So my name is Laura Tyler, and I have been advocating to support flood mitigation since 2013. And I'm just checking in today to let you know that we're still here, still advocating for South Boulder Creek flood mitigation. I was able to witness firsthand the potential for destruction. So I know that this is a life safety issue. And I would just like to remind the board that this has been put to referendum 2 times. There have been a couple of city council city council elections where this issue was a focus. And so this has been debated extensively in our community. And both times, the referendums to slow down or stall this project, they have failed overwhelmingly. So that's a sign that the people of the city of Boulder support this wholeheartedly. I support it wholeheartedly, and I encourage you to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much. We do have one other hand up. Daniel Johnson has joined us. And Mr. Johnson, you should be able to speak now.
I guess you can hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Dan Johnson. I live in West Boulder, moved here in the early 2000s. I'm by my career, I'm a water resources engineer. And with that experience, I was on the Water Resources Advisory Board from 2012 to 2017. And of course, 2013 was in the middle of that. During 2013, being a recognized water resources person, I was called out by the state engineer to look at the reservoir that's just east here. And we'll talk about Pacific, but it was having some issues and may have failed. So I spent 2 days in the downpour out there working with the state engineer and other engineers and the reservoir owner, saving that dam, which we did. I also worked with the city of Boulder. The sewer line was in severe potential of being washed out. Spent time with the city engineer at that time, trying to figure out solutions for that. So firsthand experience with floods in Boulder, particularly in 2013. I've also experienced floods in other places. I spend a lot of time on water resource work in California and experienced some of the floods that went on there this spring. I know that there's ways to mitigate floods, and I find that the plan that's put forth seems to make the most sense. We've got a lot of opportunities here to take care of some floods by increasing capacities and providing storage or retention. And so I think there's a real need to do that here. As I think somebody stated, at least now, Boulder is one of the highest at-risk cities for floods in this state for sure. So I think it's one of the areas that we need to look at. I just want to express my support. Like I said, I've been living in Boulder for over 20 years now. I like to live here. I want to stay living here, and I like to see it improve. And flood mitigation and flood hazard reduction is certainly one area that I'm interested in. So thank you for the time, and I relinquish the rest of my space.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks so much for anybody joining us. We are in the public comment phase, and I just want to make sure that those who want to speak tonight get a chance. You can hit *9 on your phone if you're joining by phone, or you can virtually raise your hand. I'll give it just one more second before public comment wraps up. Okay. I don't see any other raised hands.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Before we conclude the public comment session, though, I was wondering if Joe, if you could provide some feedback to Ms. Siegel and broadly to the public, just in terms of what the RAB's authorities are and are not with respect to the flood mitigation projects such as CU South or any other.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Gordon. And good evening, everyone, board members, members of the public. I'm Joe Tadiucci, and I'm the director of the Utilities Department. And the city code has very specific guidance for boards and what their purview is. And it's generally for RAB, the approval of that capital improvement plan and that we're dealing with here tonight in June and July. And when we bring forward flood mitigation plans or things like that, those are specific items that the board takes action on and makes a recommendation to city council. And so the The staff's role is the detailed technical analysis and verifying that our calculations and analyses are correct. And the board primary role is just general overview of our work and making sure that we've vetted it properly, that it's gone through a decent process. And you all come from backgrounds, the board members do, that have some relevance to water resources. And so it's also another multiple sets of eyes on our work if we miss something.
Thank you for that clarification.
And I might, if I might, while I'm talking, one of the speakers commented about risk to the water treatment and source water during floods. And just briefly on that, in 2013, we did experience a pretty significant flood. And we had some issues with the access road to our Batassa water treatment plant up in the mountains. And at that time, our second treatment plant, the Boulder Reservoir Water Treatment Plant, was fed only by the Boulder Supply Canal, an open canal. And that canal got so impacted by the flooding that the water had a lot of sediment in it, and we couldn't treat it for a month. One of the things that this board took action on and recommended has addressed that concern. And we put about $40+ million into the Carter Lake pipeline from Northern Water, which is a better alternative, safer alternative to get that water to the treatment plant. And since that time, since the flood, CDOT has also armored the roads, and the county has up to our treatment plant. So there's always risk to any infrastructure during a flood, but we've been aware of those risks and have addressed them. This board has participated in making recommendations on that.
And so neither of the water treatment plants would have been affected or would be affected by any flooding from South Boulder Creek. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Let's move now to the next agenda item, which is several information items, which I think will take up the bulk of our meeting today.
Sure, I can kick those off. And first one to say welcome to our newest board member, Lauren. I'm glad you could be here with us tonight, and appreciate you all bearing with us as we made our way through some technical difficulty to get started. It's always an adventure trying to make all of the gadgets work out. So as we normally do in June, we've dedicated the whole meeting tonight to the capital improvement program. And our presentation will be broken into two parts. We'll first go over the flood prioritization that was just, I think, one of the commenters mentioned, and then we'll go into the capital improvement program, which is the opposite order of what we showed on the agenda, but the prioritization and the flood plan work that comes first is really good context for the capital improvement program. And so last year, RAB made a recommendation on the flood and stormwater master plan, positive unanimous recommendation, and city council unanimously approved the stormwater and flood master plan. The primary outcome of that plan was development of a flood prioritization tool, which goes into quite a bit more detail than how the city of Boulder has prioritized flood projects in the past, which in the past, it's historically been just solely on benefit cost ratio. And we developed a tool that brought in a lot more factors that you'll hear about tonight. And it was important in our plan approval to get that prioritization tool conceptually approved first. And then a commitment we made to this board was to come back and kind of show you how that applied to the real world projects. We have just about 40 of them slated for a 30-ish year time frame. And so what you'll hear about tonight is how that tool has been applied and how all of that backlog of flood projects shapes up with that. So Brandon Coleman is here. He manages our flood and stormwater engineering team. We'll start off our presentation tonight. We also have Vicki Scharnhorst to assist with the presentation. And Vicki is a principal at the consulting firm Tetra Tech, and she oversaw development of the plan and also hands-on work with the development of the tool. So I'll turn it over to you, Brandon.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Sean. I'm just gonna close.
Yeah, I'm seeing the glare on my screen too. That helps. There. Help me. Sometimes takes a second to think.
No problem. Okay, thanks, Joe. I'm Brandon Coleman. I'm the engineering manager for the storm flood utility, and we're just gonna go over the project prioritization framework tonight. And I'm joined by Vicki Scharnhorst from Tetra Tech, who was our consultant on the comprehensive flood and stormwater master plan update effort, and also working on the prioritization framework with us as well. So tonight, I'm just going to go over a brief overview of our stormwater and flood utility. And then I'll turn it over to Vicki to go over the project prioritization framework. So the inputs, how we came up with the scores, and then also the prioritized projects. So all the projects we have listed, and then we'll turn it back over to Joe for next steps. So starting with the storm flood utility, Boulder does have the #1 flood risk in Colorado, and our mission is really protection of life, safety, and property as a utility. And we really focus on the 100-year flood event, which is a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So we have 16 major drainage ways across Boulder, all have various levels of flood protection and mitigation. And we also are responsible for the entire city. So the comprehensive flood and stormwater master plan really addresses the citywide approach to stormwater and flood management. So historically, Boulder has flooded in the past. The nice thing about Boulder is we have a long historic record all the way back to the 1800s. So some of these photos are from the 1800s, all the way through the 1920s, 1930s. We did have a significant flood event in 1969. And then even just recently, as we mentioned, June 12th, if you live in the city, there was a bunch of hail. We saw some localized flooding from that event. This picture on the bottom right is from intersection of Alpine and 9th, and we actually did have to rescue somebody from that intersection during that flood who was in a vehicle. And then most recently, the 2013 flood. So we're at the 10-year anniversary currently. So this happened in 2013. And the unique thing about the 2013 flood, it was a long duration storm event, and we saw widespread flooding throughout the city. So in all of our major drainage ways. But that did not equate to a 100-year level flood for all of the major drainage ways. So that's just a good point to point out for people that were here in 2013. We did see 100-year flooding on South Boulder Creek and on the 2 Mile Canyon Creek drainage, but not on all the drainage ways across the utility. So as our utility, this life cycle approach was really developed as part of our 2004 comprehensive flood and stormwater master plan. And we really start with floodplain mapping, which really identifies the risks related to this 1% chance annual flooding. And from there, for each drainage way, then we develop a mitigation plan, usually working with the neighborhood and the community impacted, and we evaluate alternatives at that time. And then we provide a recommendation to City Council to move forward with. And then finally, from that mitigation planning, we move to the design and construction phase. And that's really what we're here to talk about tonight. So we have completed a lot of mitigation planning across the city. We have over 30 projects that have been identified for design and construction. And now we need to start implementing the construction of those projects moving forward. And when we say construction and projects, we're kind of unique in a utility is that we really focus on nature-based solutions for flood mitigation. So places we have space, places we can promote natural stream processes. That's our approach to flood mitigation across the city. So really not trying to control floods per se, but trying to accommodate them and work with the natural processes that are happening. So on the bottom of this slide, these are all projects and areas where there has been engineered flood mitigation in the past. And most recently on the left-hand slide is our Wonderland Creek project from Winding Trails to Foothills. So That was a good segue into the Wonderland Creek project, the flood mitigation. So this was the before picture on the left-hand side. So this is the culvert, and you'll notice the apartment building directly behind there was significantly flooded in 2013. This is not Wonderland Creek, the natural historic path. So I'm going to pull up my cursor here. So when we improved this, we added these box culverts that you see on the right-hand side. And actually this existing culvert is really hidden behind these walls here on the right, just to give you some scale of what we're talking about when we do flood mitigation. So we really do have major improvements that we need to do to build out our utility. So next, just an overall timeline of how we've developed as a utility and also historic flooding. So we do have records all the way back to the 1800s, as I mentioned. So we do have some large floods of record from the 1800s and also the early 1900s. And I mentioned that 1969 flood. So after the 69 flood, the Mile High Flood District was formed, and we also formed the stormwater and flood utility for the city in 1973. And our first master planning effort was the Comprehensive Drainage Utility and Master Plan, which was developed in 1984. And then we updated that to the Comprehensive Flood and Stormwater Master Plan in 2004. And we had that master plan available to us for the 2013 flooding. So that's the approach we took for flood mitigation from 2013. And then most recently in September of 2022, we've updated the flood and stormwater master plan. And that's what we're here tonight to talk about. So there were some key outcomes from that master plan. They really focused on how we're going to deal with climate change, maintenance, and also community outreach. But in the upper left-hand box, you'll see this is directly from the plan. There was really a desire to prioritize the projects across the city that are going to do the greatest good first. And that's really what we're going to talk about tonight. So that prioritization framework that we developed through that plan, how that's been applied to the projects we've identified. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki to walk through the prioritization framework.
Thank you, Brandon. So Brandon talked about the cycle of major flood projects, and historically it has taken as long as up to 20 years to get a project to fruition and providing benefits. So one of the real missions of this effort was to make sure that we aligned the prioritization tool with core community values, but minimized the debate over which projects would go next. This next slide shows you the major criteria that were used in the model. And you might ask where we got those. There are 7 major criteria listed here, and they are listed from what the community deemed to be most important down to still important, but multiple benefits was ranked last. So we did quite a bit of community outreach. That included asking residents and citizens to vote for these criteria, and we brainstormed what the criteria should be. Certainly on Be Heard Boulder, we did 6 basin-specific meetings that you could think of as neighborhood meetings. We met in person, sometimes at the farmers market to help people with their voting, but everything from hometown festival, just wherever we could think that we might be able to grab some people during the pandemic and help them get their votes in. So I'd like to think about this matrix and sort of turn it sideways and go into like what we call the decision hierarchy. So after the voting, you can see at the top again, we ranked life safety at the top. And I'll go just a little bit. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide to walk through what all this means and how it informs that framework. So life safety received a 29% vote. So out of 100, the citizens felt this was truly important with respect to life and property. So the way that the framework works, one of the criterion, and then we have sub-criteria that are used. So protect critical facilities. So think of these facilities as senior care, daycare facilities, police and fire access in and out during an emergency. Those are critical facilities. That, as well as the ability to remove residential units from the high hazard zone, were 2 of the major factors that go into the framework to help provide quantitative data against which to rank projects. Next in line, ranked effectiveness. Effectiveness got 20% of the vote from our citizens. And that one of those items is to protect property. Joe mentioned sort of decoupling benefits with cost, and so that's what we did. We showed the benefits as far as physical structures removed from the 100-year floodplain, but we also take into account economic benefit from also to structures, et cetera. I'll talk about equity a bit more next, but just to say it ranked third highest at 18% by the citizens. Also, residents ranked environmental and cultural protection of both environmental and cultural resources as fourth highest, and put a pretty high stake on that. That was at 11%. So you start to get down to cost, and we did not see the same concern or interest about cost. And so in the case of the model, the more expensive a project, the lower score it actually accrues. So that is ranked as 10% of the overall project score. And these last two, I'll just go through briefly. These are the only two qualitative criteria out of all 7. Ability to implement. So that is, think about the constraints that might be on a project in order to implement it. So perhaps there are easements in place, perhaps, or perhaps there's certain legal, institutional, or permitting constraints on a project. That's how we rank that from 1 to 5. And then as well as does the project have broad community support or not so much? And of course, the more support ranked 1 to 5, the higher support it got and scoring. And then lastly, multiple benefits. And that's one just to think in terms of, does the project, if built, offer things that are in addition to flood control benefits or flood protection? So this might be assisting with the safer routes to school, which at least one of the projects does, or perhaps there are other projects being constructed at the same time. And so it'd be better to tear everything up at once if we had to do that. All right. So I said I would talk just a little bit more about equity, just to explain how we actually provided a quantitative metric for this one criterion. This social vulnerability index is a ranking applied to each of the census tracts. This is done nationwide by the Centers of Disease Control, but we pull the data off the publicly available data off the system. They take 15 social factors and they rank them into 4 major categories. So these are items such as socioeconomic factors, household composition. This might be elderly or young personnel in that area, or single parent households. Also minority status, percent of people with English as a second language, and lastly, housing type and transportation. So these might be people who lack access or ability to evacuate. These are multi-unit structures, apartment buildings, and mobile homes. All right. So this is a list of all the projects in alphabetical order that had made it through that project life cycle. So they've gone through the mitigation plans. They've been developed as reaches, which you see on this right-hand column. And these were the projects we were asked to put in the framework. All right, it's a little easier to see if you see it on a map. So I'm going to walk you through sort of a north, central, and south Boulder, sort of by reach. All right, so the first one is North Boulder. You see 4 Mile Creek, which goes from about Lee Canyon Road down to about 28th Street. The second project in the North Boulder area is the Wonderland Creek. And it also goes down to 28th Street. Sort of an interesting thing you'll see with all of the projects is we typically build projects from downstream to upstream, and you'll start to notice, well, what happened to segment 1 or 2? Well, those projects have already been constructed. And so that's what you see right here on this slide. Central Boulder, 2 Mile goes from city limits down to about 24th Street, or about down to Goose Creek, that confluence. And similarly, the Goose Creek system that remains goes from North Boulder Park down to that confluence as well. Then you see Gregory, Bluebell, Kings, and Skunk, and they all, of course, receive water from well outside and above the Chautauqua area. And lastly, the South Boulder projects include both Bear Creek and South Boulder Creek. All right, so how did things fare? So I'll go through this at a certain pace, and then of course we can answer any questions that the board has. So these were the top ranked projects according to the framework and the quantitative and qualitative data that we discussed. A nice way to look at it is in this next graphic, which gives you a nice visual for why projects scored as they did. So you start to see in the right-hand side of the screen, life safety, because it had 29% of the weight, you start to see the impact of that criteria. But you also, you look at the top 3 criteria then, also effectiveness, which is the gray bar, and then equity, that's sort of cerulean blue bar there. So you really get a sense looking at this for how projects rank when they really scored well in any of those top criteria. This next sheet shows you the whole list of projects. So you take all 36 projects and look how they stacked up sort of in just as a numerical order. But on this next slide, you also see those 4 projects, which are already in the capital improvement program and were when we started this exercise, but we did promise we would come back to the board and show everyone how those projects actually stacked up when they were actually input into the actual framework. All right, so the last 3 slides of my presentation will show you of the 36, we broke them into tranches of 12. So the first and top 12 are shown here. And again, you get that visual for how things stack up. We included a couple extra at the bottom because here's an interesting thing to see too. You see at the bottom, Bluebell 2, it doesn't have much of a life safety component, but it really scored quite well when it came to effectiveness because that project, for instance, removes 304 structures from the 100-year floodplain. But when you juxtapose it, say against Skunk 07, which is 6 projects ranked above it, Skunk scored quite high. It still has 46 structures that get removed. So it's still very effective in removing structures from the 100-year floodplain. But you can also see it has a quite high social vulnerability index as a 0.6 on a scale of 0 to 1. So that's how that made the big difference. Here's the second round, the middle ranked group from 13 through 24. And I guess maybe one interesting thing I pick when I look at this is that if you look at Gregory phase 1, you see that it scores well on life safety, but it also ranks number 20 overall in its overall abilities. And the reason for that is it is a project that its level of service is for a 10-year interval storm as opposed to 100 years. So it wasn't quite as effective as some of the others. All right, and then here are the last dozen projects. And in this, I think one of the things you can take away from looking at this is if you look at the bottom, you'll start to see of the 7 criteria, many of these projects don't actually get scoring. They don't have an appreciable score in all 7 areas. And so therefore their priority came down toward the bottom. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joe, who can talk a little bit about next steps.
Yeah, so what you're seeing here tonight and what Vicki just went through is really kind of the first path for staff to apply the prioritization tool. And we didn't do any massaging of it or combining projects or things like that we might normally do, or taking into account other factors. And so we thought it was really important for the public and the board to kind of see it first in its raw form before we started doing that kind of thing. And so our plan would be to take this iteration of information and then in the next year put that level of analysis to it, and we'll have that'll inform that year's 6-year CIP, and we'll have that going forward. So I think it's really taking what we have tonight, which is a big step forward for this year's CIP, and then continuing to expand on it for next year.
At this point, questions from the board? I guess maybe I should say, are there anything from other staff members, Audrey? Okay, well, thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Joe, for the context, and Brandon for the intro on that. Sure. Question?
I have a quick question. I don't remember whether to what extent we discussed this a year ago, but was the ranking system based solely on input from the public?
You mean in the prioritization tool and how it came out on life safety?
Right.
Yeah,
And RAB voted, the community working group voted, and then the rest of it would have been citizens within the city.
yeah, I mean, it was definitely a public process. And that informed how it came out. As staff, we have technical expertise as well, and we're looking at that information as.
I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. How much was this based on sort of general public input versus maybe more specific, expertise around these types of issues? What was the sort of the balance that led to these final kind of specific weightings?
Well, Brandon and Vicky may have more to add to it, but I think we were looking at it as it was being processed and generally agreed that it seemed to be correct. And so I don't know if you have.
Sure. Yeah, so the way we gathered the input from the community was we did a dot storming exercise. So we had all the criteria that you saw and we said, here's a certain number of dots, place which one's the most important. And that's how we generated the percentages for the main criteria. And then from that, a lot of the technical information, so structures protected, roadways protected, high hazard zone benefits, cultural resources in the area, critical facilities in the area. Those are all generated as part of the mitigation planning effort for how we evaluate alternatives. So we essentially pulled all that data in to the project prioritization tool so we could look at it across all the different drainage ways. So that's the first time we've ever done that as a utility. So the technical work really happens within the mitigation planning efforts. And then what we're doing is trying to pull all that in and trying to standardize that across the city. Is that?
I guess I'm just a little bit confused by how much the public input on this actually drove the percentages that we see here versus internal staff expertise was more familiar with the details driving the process. The reason I say it is a couple of these points, the bottom couple look, smaller than I would have expected from the staff, for example, or from a water engineer. It seems that those are sort of underweighted. So I'm just trying to get a sense of how much did the public input drive the process versus a more knowledgeable staff process driver.
And I lost my train of thought a second ago. So our staff and our technical experts, Vicky and Brandon, we framed the whole thing to bring to the public. So just the framework for the package that we asked the public to vote on, that wasn't just a free-for-all. It had our technical expertise as a basis. And then it really was the public's input and voting on that determined the factors. I think we tended to agree with what they came up with. If there had been a situation where we were really concerned that something didn't look right, I'm sure we would have intervened. So happy to talk through factors that you might have thought we would have looked at differently, but.
I just thought the last two, the cost and the ease of implementation and however you described it, seemed kind of low relative to clearly you'd like to sort of rank each one of these as 50%, but since we can't do that, it seemed like those are kind of seemed low to me relative to a couple of the factors higher up.
I can probably help too. Funny, I don't know what happened to my computer there. But cost in particular, so historically, flood mitigation projects are selected based on a benefit cost analysis. And that's a benefit for estimated property damage versus the cost to implement the mitigation. And what we found is that is not always equitable in a lot of cases. So that's why we had a huge community outreach effort as part of the CFS when we did this development, to make sure that we were representing the community values so we could have community buy-in on these projects. And then also move away from a strict cost benefit analysis comparison, because each, as we mentioned, there's so many different drainage ways and boulders, and to compare them that way was very difficult. So we did move away from cost being a primary driver for the projects. But we did focus a lot on life safety because we heard that from the community, and that's also our mission as a utility. And we really find that as the high hazard zone mitigation when you get there. So we did move cost lower. And that is probably because that's what we heard from the community, and also a little bit by design on how we wanted to see how to evaluate these projects next to each other.
Yeah, one of the themes was prioritize projects that do the greatest good first. And so at the other end of the scale, it seemed like life safety is being at the top was.
And technical staff created the quantitative scale that translates into actual scores or criteria.
Right, so the community, so let's see here, I can probably share, but that spider matrix that Vicky showed, which is part of the CFS, the community really focused on the first tier of that. And then what it went into those tiers was where staff really had input. So what does life safety mean? How would we evaluate that? We recommended some data that could actually quantify that moving forward.
What was the size of the public population?
There were 90 persons. And we worked really hard to get folks out during COVID, even on the Be Heard Boulder people. We advertised in the paper, people were allowed to go in and vote electronically. So in the end, we were, I think, quite happy to get 90.
This is naivete because I'm new. So those 90 people, they dictated the weightings, so the 29%, 20%. Then how does that translate into the prioritization list? Because on that list, there are some in the top 10 that don't have any life safety at all.
So they, I don't know if you're able to share, if you can even pull up one of the, so it is true that when we say they have no life safety, there are projects that don't either benefit critical facilities, they're not pulling critical facilities out of the high hazard zone, for instance, or there's no concern about pulling, that's not a reach or an area where stormwater or floods go over thoroughfare, for instance. They don't necessarily impact a major roadway. And so those will not attribute as much of a score for life safety.
Okay, so if it's 29% is the weighting for life safety.
Right.
Then for those that don't have any life safety component to them, how are those in the top 10? I guess is that question.
Right, they would have to have a strong
something else
component,
okay.
a strong
Very
equity
strong
component,
Got it.
a strong cost reverse matrix. So if the cost of the project is lower, it would rate higher, it would get a higher score for cost. So you will see, I think that was the interesting thing for us as staff,
right,
is we haven't put all these metrics together for these projects and gave us a very standard kind of quantitative approach to compare projects across the city. So even though we may identify it as a strong life safety project, it may not have the right equity component, right? There may be a more equitable project that's actually driving this. So that's what the tool is actually meant to do for us.
I guess this didn't happen, but what if there was a scenario where all of the projects that ended up in the top 10 were in the same neighborhood? Where you're biasing geographically, I imagine you would still need to go and apply a distribution of where projects occur to make sure that you have that kind of equity. And that kind of management of disruption projects.
Right. I think that's what Joe was talking about, was really, this is taking all the data, dropping it in, having the reaches. When it comes to grouping these as projects or identifying reaches that may go together, like that's really the next step in this process. So we did look really hard at the project lists and how they ranked based on the data and just kind of validated it for ourselves. Like, does this make sense? So it's a good question, and we did look at some of those areas that got flagged higher if it was more projects in that area, but we would also be able to see what's driving that as well. So if it is a very socially vulnerable area of the city, that would also be indicated in our metrics. So we'd be able to say that's why we're targeting these projects now.
Could you describe in a more general way, kind of a higher level way of how you took the assigned value for a given criteria and translated that into a score? It looks like the scores on the bar charts maybe equaled 1 in theory, and they never quite got that high. But how would you equate, particularly like the number of homes out of the floodplain to a 1 to 5 ranking in a different criteria or percent ranking in other criteria? I'm not sure how those relate, or how you came up with ultimately a unit score.
And I'm gonna let our project tool expert comment on how the numbers all crunch.
Absolutely. So I think, Gordon, think about, it's just a big spreadsheet. So you know that, for instance, one of the metrics you mentioned would go under the effectiveness category. So number of structures removed. So one of the examples I gave was Bluebell O2, which has 304 structures that are identified in that mitigation plan that would be removed from that 100-year floodplain. So you take effectiveness is worth 20%. And so between reduced physical damage and reduced economic loss, reducing physical damage, the number of buildings was ranked as 60% as more important as opposed to reducing economic loss. So it literally is just a multiplication of, in that 1 or that 100, you know, however you look at it, that's that fraction or percentage of that criteria that it provides a value or a piece of that weighted whole to that one project reach, if that makes sense. So if you just do the math in the model, it goes 20% times that overall 80% times the 60% times the 304 structures. So some of these projects might have no structures that get pulled out of the 100-year floodplain. So then it doesn't get a score attributed in that example.
So it wasn't, it's if you said, okay, if it's more than 100 structures, it gets full 100%.
No.
You actually have it tied to the number of structures.
Correct. And maybe just to give you some additional comfort, the quantitative metrics in here, I mean, there are 580 data points, and it is by and large quantitative data that's publicly available. And where we could, it was always a multiplication. So it wasn't just, oh, I don't know, it looks kind of like that might work. We were always using the actual metrics that were available.
Can we see that spreadsheet?
I
Share it, I guess.
I can.
We don't have to do it now, but just in general, would you be able to share that with the board?
Yeah. Yes, we can. Cool.
Just don't break it.
Right on.
So Vicky, to follow up on that, thank you for that explanation. On the number of homes, I understand, because it's literally the number of homes times all the various factors, right, that make up the weighting. Compared to that, say to a criteria that has a 1 to 5 ranking or a criteria that has a percent ranking, is that to say that one home would be equal to a score of 3 compared to a score of 4, or one home would be equal to 10% compared to 12% on some other factor? In other words, how do you balance those?
So in the overall spreadsheet, it's just adding in the overall values. So I'm thinking of the 1 to 5 criteria. So and let me just think of a good example where we use 1 to 5 just for more simplicity. Certainly the 2 that are 1 to 5 are the 2 qualitative ones, as you surmised. As far as sort of environmental and cultural, those are either actual eligible cultural resources. We don't have access, like, I'm not an archaeologist, so we had one of our archaeologists go in and literally look at the eligibility of the sites that would be inundated with a project versus without. So again, it's a real metric, it's a number. But then in order to put it into the model, that one was ranked from 1 to 36. Okay, so that's an example of where we took quantitative data. It's still quantitative, but we made it semi-quantitative so that for a ranking perspective, you can see where it stacks with respect. As I said, the other qualitative data, for the most part, we have real data, and it's just truly a multiplication factor. Road level of service, again, Brandon mentioned it uses traffic data with inundation and without, so that much access you maintain accessibility during an emergency. So I don't know, Gordon, if you have a specific question about any of the other 1 to 5 criteria. I want to make sure I'm not missing your question.
Not at this time, because prior to our receiving this packet a week ago, we really didn't have any of the details behind it. So we're just kind of hearing this, really seeing it in action for the first time. I was trying to think big picture, how do you equate a home or a percent or one other metric, any of the other metrics to a number or other different criteria? What equals what across the different criteria is what I'm trying to get at. So does the spreadsheet have a column for each criteria saying, like, here's the range? Like you mentioned, one of them is 36 factors, so it'd be probably 1 to 36, or
That
the number
one,
of homes speaks for itself.
right.
And so that's in the spreadsheet, so we can see kind of what the range is of that particular parameters metric.
Correct.
And I'm just,
Was the absolute cost of the individual projects taken into account
Yes.
in that cost component, or how was it incorporated in the,
Right.
You could theoretically have a project that ranked exactly the same on all the characteristics, and one of them cost $10 million and one of them cost $1 million, and would they be ranked equally?
No, in that case, the $1 million project actually goes up in the ranking because historically there was a concern that there might be projects out there that could be easier on the checkbook, but might offer similar value. And so in this case, you can think of cost as a disbenefit. It's a reverse, like the more expensive the project, the lower ranking it got from a cost attribute.
And I'll just point out that that's something we noticed when we were going through this is you'll see, oh, goodness, okay. So looking at the cost bars, the way we've broken up these mitigation plans is by reach. So we have very similar costs for a lot of different projects. South Boulder Creek at number 1 is a detention project with a much more cost than all the other projects. So you didn't see a huge variability in the projects being driven by cost per se, aside from the South Boulder Creek project, because it is significantly expensive. So some of those bars look very similar as you go down because you see a lot of similar benefits or similar costs for the projects. And what we're looking is how do we differentiate across the city for what projects we should really be targeting next.
so I know that Vicky and Brandon have the PDF of the spreadsheet and could share that on the screen. I'm thinking if we try to go into that tonight, we better order some pizzas because we'll be here for a while, but you're asking really fair and valid questions and can see that you really dug into it. What might make sense is for us to walk you through a real world, one of the projects and an example of how we came up with the numbers. I don't know if we could do that as an email or something afterwards or part of the next packet for July. Would that help?
Yes, it would. Vicky, you mentioned that cost is a disbenefit or a negative score. Were there any other factors that were negative scores?
Certainly, if it was difficult, so ability to implement, you can think of as if it had a lot of constraints on it, that was a qualitative one that was easy, neutral, difficult. So that's how that one was ranked. Similarly, community support, it was a 1 through 5. So it would be a negative if it wasn't resoundingly. It's not a negative number, but low number, right? It's not. So maybe that's not exactly what you're asking, but for the most part, I think walking you through it, it'll make sense. How this one was a.
And I'll say cost doesn't go against your score. It's just the least cost projects got the highest score for cost. So we're really targeting projects that are least expensive to see if it maximizes our bang for our buck.
That would only be 10% weighting.
Correct.
It's not large.
Yes, that's right.
Just real quick on this, I understand how you can do you could figure out relatively easily the multiple benefits and the constraints, qualitative numbers, but the community acceptance and support, especially by individual reach, that seems hard. I guess, how did you come up with that number?
So the way we did it was we really went back to the decision makers, so RAB recommendations and also city council recommendations. And we didn't give anything a 5 on community support because we didn't want to bias ourselves. So we really tried to see if there was split votes from city council or from RAB within those recommendations, and then we would rank them lower. And then some of the projects we know that have been discussed heavily in the public, we tried to rank lower just to not bias ourselves from a community support aspect.
I think this is related to the flood stuff, but stormwater flood. There are 2 maps, and I'm trying to understand what they're telling us exactly. I understand the social vulnerability index as it relates to census tracts, but one of the maps has shapes highlighted with darker and slightly different colors, and then the other has just outlines. And so just because I know we all like maps and maps are very helpful for understanding. I just wondered what the message was for both of these maps.
Absolutely. So just quickly, you see first on the screen, the SVI map by census tract. So those, and then you also, of course, in the legend, see if it's green, it has a low social vulnerability on that tract. Versus red being the most vulnerable populations live within that census tract. So if Brandon goes to the next slide, then you see how we did a weighted average. So we literally took the area that would benefit from that project and did a weighted average using GIS.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the 36 projects outlined.
Exactly.
A question just on how to actually translate this prioritized project list or make it actionable. I think I saw on your last slide, it would start in 2030. Does that mean for next year's CIP, we'll start to see this come into play? So in other words, would you just walk down this list in terms of what gets included in starting next year in the 2030 recommended or projected? I forget the language, but is that, how does this actually translate to the CIP? Is my question.
Generally, yes, we will follow that list. I think we need to do another round where we combine some things, some reaches might go together. Gordon and I had an agenda meeting on Friday and I was describing, I don't know that it was ever our intent that we would just apply this blindly, the raw data without some judgment applied. And for example, the Upper Goose, I think reach 6 is fairly low on the priority list. But in that email, a hotline email I sent today, the stormwater upgrades, which is the piped infrastructure in that area around the old hospital and Ideal Market, probably the highest priority stormwater upgrades in the city, as you saw the flooding from some of the photos and things. So when we take that into account, reach number 6 might be 20th on the on the flood list. But then it's got to receive that water from the stormwater upgrades. And so we'll take factors like that into account. And as we continue to refine that, you'll see that in future years CIP. And then another important factor, and you may recall, when we were reviewing the plan last year, there are already some projects that we've invested significant funds in. Gregory Creek was an example of that. Certainly South Boulder Creek is the biggest example. And so we committed to this board that we would show how the priorities shook out. But our intention is not to stop projects in process that we've already invested a lot of in community engagement and a lot of funds in, and kind of lose that momentum and that investment. So at some point we'll take off with the new projects and you'll really just see the list.
It's just a similar. I think it's a similar question about this, but so for the list now, the prioritized list of 36, there's 4 that are currently under the CIP. Were those under the CIP because they were evaluated under the cost benefit analysis that was used prior? And so now those will be reevaluated to determine if they're still on CIP, or they probably will still be, but is that why those, like 3 of them are far down on this prioritization list?
Yes, and one of those 3 is the Goose Creek Reach 6 that I just mentioned.
Okay.
That needs it. If we build the stormwater piped infrastructure upstream, but there's nowhere for that water to go, it'll actually make things worse for the people downstream. And so we have to do that 19th priority flood project on to receive that water. We have not taken those types of things into account yet. And I really want to commend Vicky and Brandon and the team. It was really a Herculean effort to get this ready for the first pass. And so it's going to take time to refine it. And I think each year that we come forward with the CIP, it'll be more and more meaningful. And
So along those lines, well, I share your acknowledgement of Vicky and Brandon and your respective teams for doing this. I think one of the most urgent needs for the city is conscientious prioritized flood protection. And this really gets us there. Particularly in light of the fact that if the utility department is willing to take a look at the projects that are in the queue, the 36 odd, or say take away the 4 others, but 30 plus projects, and perhaps reassess some of the scoring factors.
Yeah.
Like the examples that you gave, which may explain the 4 projects that are up on the board right now that are not in the top 5. Number 1 is, but the other 3 are not. Perhaps that suggests that some of the weighting factors could be adjusted. And one that comes to mind in particular, based on what you were sharing, Joe, was the perhaps the multiple benefits criteria, which is pretty low. It's one of the lowest. And there may be others that perhaps if those weighting factors were increased, of course, others would have to go down to make it equal to 100%. But that might cause those projects to actually move up in the priority list, which would then further justify why they're in the process right now, whereas the others are not.
yeah. No, we can certainly take a look at that. And I will also say to Steve's initial question, again, our staff take a look at how these shook out, and there's just is there anything on this list that just does not seem right to us, or worse yet, does this seem all messed up? And had that been our reaction to it, we would have raised our hand and said, Brad, we have a problem here. It was a good theory, but it didn't work. And generally, I think we're comfortable with this. And really, the situation we were trying to address with the master plan is we have these 16 drainages. I've said it, we've all said it over and over again, that Boulder was formed after and developed before modern floodplain regulations came into play. And so a big portion of the city has been developed and encroached on the floodplains. And for the people who will have negative impacts or things they don't like about the projects, we know we'll have vocal opposition. we also know there are people who desperately want to see the flood improvements made. And so how do we get ourselves out of this dilemma of pitting one drainage against another, and it kind of never ends? And so having some basis for how we prioritize these. And we could go on refining and debating the factors for a long time, but I'm feeling really good about where we're at and applying this, and it feels like a logical iteration for that all makes sense.
It does, although I'd have to contest something that was said earlier, which is that, yes, the RAB did see and approve the CFS, which included the discussion on ranking. But the weighting factors, if I recall right, were in volume 2, pretty deep. I think I'm under 33 because I looked at it this afternoon, and they were listed as suggested rankings. And they were presented in the context of, I think, 3 or 4 theoretical projects, which may in fact have been some of the projects that actually exist here, but they weren't as you actually run them through the system.
Yeah.
So I would like to think that those weighting factors are not as cast in stone as you're implying, because they were sort of theoretical or preliminary. And I would really encourage staff to be open to seeking input on some of those weighting factors. Not the detailed numbers that go into it, or not the criteria themselves, but just the weighting factors.
I think we're open to that feedback. The reality of the budget process is that we kind of have to go with what we have now for this year's budget iteration. But you could certainly, when it gets time for board action next month, you could have that be part of the narrative that goes with the recommendation or a motion. If you wanted us to look at that again. Process wise, these master plans go through a ton of process and are vetted, and they go through board and council approval process, often with multiple meetings. So it's not an easy lift for us to get those redone. So there'd have to be some real compelling reason to look at that, but we're open for that.
Well, I would argue that until tonight, and no one in the community has actually seen this rolled out. Unlike some of the other utility department systems, like for the prioritizing the water and wastewater systems, I believe that the AIM is one. Those are fairly mature, and they've probably stood the test of time and have probably been iterated upon, but this one's not. So it's kind of a different animal.
Yeah.
And I understand the city process, but nonetheless, to make it as effective as it can be, a round of iteration on some of the weighting factors may actually be the best thing that could come out of it.
Yeah, that's fine. If you're going to give us that feedback, I would ask that you be really specific on what you want us to look at and change, or what might be less desirable about the way they've.
Yes, I was going to ask a question similar to Lauren. The fact that some of the projects that were already in progress were rated fairly lowly by this new scaling process suggests that this is kind of a radical, maybe a significant rethinking or new process in the way that the utility is going to prioritize projects. And I think it's great to have a more quantitative and more, thorough way of doing that. But I guess and I understand that we could sit out here and debate this forever, but I guess the critical comment that you made, Joe, to me is that you believe that the staff supports these weightings pretty thoroughly. And that, my only concern is are we overemphasizing the input of 90 people in the community to gear spending of hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 30 years, which is great to have community input, and they may have some very good perspectives on things. But are we making sure that we have the expertise that's available to us that's overseeing or double checking or kind of making sure that those things make sense? Because it's going to be, as this gets cemented into more of a process over time, like the other two utilities have now, this is going to determine where, you know, where an awful lot of dollars are spent, and we just want to make sure that that's, you know, that it's a logical and well thought out and kind of well debated and argued about, you know, system and process before it kind of gets locked in stone.
Yeah, there's a lot of expertise in the room with Brandon and Vicky. And this also matches with my technical background and lots of years of experience. And I knew how important this was to the community. And I've also been watching it closely along the way and checking in with the team. And does this seem right to us? And we're comfortable with it. So I don't want people to go away with, wow, this seems like it was a free for all and 90 people just sort of set the stage for everything. We framed it with that expertise in a way that they could provide input with some boundaries on it. And I think we got good feedback. Interestingly, we're just starting through the city budget process, and utilities budget is as big as the whole rest of the cities. And if you compare it to other departments, no offense to our team members, but like doing underground pipes and stuff, it's just not as exciting to the community as a new park or a new open space purchase or a new library or something like that. We always get relatively low numbers for public participation, and we're always challenging ourselves to improve that, but it's been elusive. It's like getting excited to put new tires on the family sedan. It's just like, I really want to spend money or attention on that.
Okay, just real quick, I don't want to belabor, but just to add to this point, because I want to see this work and be effective. So it needs public credibility to be effective. I'm concerned that someone just sees the prioritized list, and then sees 3 projects not in the top 5 moving forward. And it's like, are we going to do this list? And then utility just kind of says what's really going to happen. So in other words, like, is there a way to Gordon's point, maybe to refine things so that it does take into account more different components, so that it is a very objective, credible approach? That would be my only concern, because I really think this is a good tool. I want to see it work. I just worried about a misperception of how it played out. So
yeah, for sure.
My thought.
And the dilemma when we change our approach for any process, especially something that's kind of as slow rolling as the CIP, you have to make some cutoff decisions. And like, these projects that were done previously under this scenario are going to stay the way we are, and we're not talking about those. And you remember last year when we were talking to Rab, there was some direction from the board for us to show the existing projects so that we could see them. And I was concerned about that for that very reason, because we were potentially just going to be putting ourselves in a spot that didn't acknowledge that reality of having to have a cutoff. And we would there'd be no end to relitigating, and like, well, that shouldn't be on the list.
I also think it may be important to think about the context. You know, right now, FEMA is going through the process of refining their benefit cost analysis to better account for equity. And that's going to reprioritize a ton of projects across the United States because of they're essentially doing a version of what the city of Boulder is doing. So this effort is consistent with what progressive, thoughtful communities and agencies are trying to do to sort of reset the prioritization of, you know, flood mitigation projects, because previously it meant that money went to the most valuable properties. So, I mean, that is one of the criteria, but so much of these other criteria are trying to get at this larger, bigger picture community benefit that wasn't really captured by a straight up monetary benefit cost analysis.
Yeah, I'd also mention that we did have a community working group that was formed at the beginning of the master plan process and followed along closely. And many meetings, the whole 18-month process. So to Amy's point, I will say, in my time in utilities and just seeing the work that we do, I recall in our water supply planning when we started to bring in the climate change science into the work and really built that into the technical analysis and planning of our water supply. And I felt proud of the organization and proud to be part of the department because I thought it was really cutting edge, practical stuff and a better way of contemplating the climate realities and building it into our world in a practical way. When I saw the initial application of this in a meeting with Brandon and Vicky, I had the same reaction, that it is the same kind of leading edge work that others are going to follow. So I feel, not to say it can't be refined and we can't continue to talk about it, but I feel strongly that this is good work and it's a much better way of prioritizing projects.
One other question is, the South Boulder Creek project covers a big footprint, whereas the others are much smaller. And so it seems like the way the metrics are established is that they favor the bigger projects, particularly, the number of homes removed or something like that. And so I wonder, for most of the drainages, except for South Boulder Creek, I guess that is broken into three phases, not three geographic areas. But I wonder what would happen if you looked at an entire drainage way, like instead of 16 separate view streets and 4 separate 2 miles or what have you, and just look at it as an aggregate and how that would affect the scoring.
I'll just say South Boulder Creek scored very high. It's also a very unique project to the city because it is the only major regional detention project and probably the only space we have as a city to implement that regional detention project. So you'll see a lot of the homes and the properties get completely removed from the floodplain in that 1% chance storm. So it does have a very high score because it is a very unique project for us as a city. And a lot of the other projects are focused on conveyance and also keeping on what.
The questions from the board? Yes.
Appreciate the feedback and spirited discussion on that. And I think the one action item that we're committing to is showing an example and walking the board through. Whether we do that as an email or part of the next packet, we'll figure that out.
I would like to augment, if I may, I'm sending out a version of the spreadsheet, PDF version or what have you. So we can really look at the metrics.
Okay, so moving on more generally, that was context for, of course, the flood and stormwater program is one of our 3 utilities, and that was just really contextual information. Important contextual information for that part of the CIP. But going back more generally, the overall CIP for the 3 utilities. For the board members who have been on the board for a while, that we would normally do the CIP in 3 separate meetings, May, June, and July. May, we always kind of show you where we left off last year and kind of a reminder for that. We always have a new.
Excuse me, I apologize for interrupting, but before Brandon Coleman and Vicky Shorthorse leave, I want to thank you. Great presentation and really good work.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I just got rolling there. Thanks for that interruption. But so May, we would take a look back at where we left off last year. We always dedicate the June meeting as much as we can to do a deep dive into the CIP. And then we come back in July, having hopefully responded to your feedback and asked for a recommendation. And I already touched on it, but I sent out the post today because it's a good example. The presentation we just had, it's graphics and figures, and it's like, and we're talking about tables of dollar values, and that's kind of the package of information. But 2 Mondays ago, we experienced a real world situation with the major thunderstorm that came through Boulder, and you got to see the impact of it. And our highest priority stormwater projects that are in the CIP are aimed at fixing that. So it was just a really good opportunity to show some real world. Like, this is what we're talking about, and it's not just tables and graphics and figures. And then I just wanted a staffing update relevant to tonight. Graham Clark, our principal budget analyst, had a golden career opportunity. He's been hired by the city and county of Broomfield to be a deputy finance director. So it's a career step for him. It's in line with his career goals. Unfortunately, Friday was his last day with the organization. We've been through a budget analyst lead person transition just a couple of years ago. And so we've got the backup to continue to support the process, but we're really sorry to see Graham go, and happy for him that he has a great opportunity. So our presentation will be led tonight by Chris Douglas, who is our senior manager of our utilities engineering group, and Chris Duval, who is deputy director of our operations. And before I turn it over to them, this is all so much, particularly Lauren, for a new board member. It's 3 separate utilities. It's several $1 billion worth of infrastructure, and we're so tied into the details. We just kind of launch into it and start talking about projects, but it really boils down to several systems. In the water system, you have the source water components, which are before treatment. So the big reservoirs that you see up in the mountains, like Barker Reservoir in Netherlands, we have 15 of those throughout the mountains, and including Boulder Reservoir. The large transmission pipelines to convey those. And then you have the water treatment plants. We have 2 of those that I mentioned earlier. And then under every city street, there are water pipelines in the water distribution system. And so those are the primary components, the major components of the water system. In wastewater, similarly, there's a collection system in or adjacent to all of the streets in the city that collects wastewater from homes and businesses, and eventually channels it down or funnels it down to a single larger pipeline. That's our wastewater collection system. And then that water is delivered to the treatment plant. We have 1 wastewater treatment plant. And then lastly, the third utility is stormwater and flood. And you have underground infrastructure and all of the pipes that collect water from streets, similar to the wastewater system. It collects and conveys that water and then dumps it into the bigger drainages so that it can safely, as we develop the project, safely travel through the system. So Chris Douglas and Chris DeVille are going to walk through, and we'll be talking about specific projects, but you'll probably recognize they're all parts of those major components. That's enough for me. Chris Douglas.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, board members. As Joe mentioned, I'm Chris Douglas, the Senior Utilities Engineering Manager, really managing capital projects for all 3 of the utilities. This is the first of our 2 meetings that we'll have this year on the CIP. Typically, we have 3 meetings, but Gordon, as you mentioned earlier, the May meeting, we talked about the board was working through the equity training, but we did provide just sort of a general overview of the utility system in that memorandum for that May meeting. And then Chris DeVille is also here with me, and he's really filling in what has typically been what Graham Clark's position was. So Chris is really going to dive into some of the financial aspects. And then I also do have, for additional support, our utilities engineering supervisors that manage really those 3 utilities, and as Joe kind of broke it up, we kind of break up the water into the source water into the treated water group. So that's where we have those 4 supervisors here as well. So just as an overview on the agenda, again, I'll talk through just really an overview on the capital improvements program, then highlight on some of the key projects you'll see in the CIP, not nearly all of them. And then Chris will talk about financial matters, really dealing with rate changes and financial impacts, and then we'll have some discussion and question time with the board. So as we move forward with this, just some things for you, like you to consider as we're going through this presentation is just thinking about questions you may have about particular projects, clarifications or additional information you might be interested in related to the finances of the utilities, and then also any questions about rates. So before we discuss some of the specific projects in the 2024 to 2029 capital improvements program, I'd like to discuss some concepts on how we evaluate projects. There are many variables that staff review to make recommendations for the CIP. These variables are identified on the slide. Of specific note, RAB identified aging infrastructure in previous letters to council as a top priority. We've been applying that concept in conjunction with the other variables to choose projects. For instance, one of the projects we'll talk about this evening is the phosphorus upgrades project at the Water Resources Recovery Facility, or WRF. And it replaces aging assets and addresses regulatory issues. So really trying to hit at least two of those categories within a single project. To address the aging of assets, as Gordon, as you talked about earlier, we've been using the AIM, or Asset Inventory Maintenance methodology, for the last few years. This includes a utility condition index scoring. Really, it's a weighting methodology, or as we look at individual assets to identify within different aspects within the treated water system. The scoring is one tool for choosing projects. We also have to consider public safety, quality of life, and economic vitality when we're looking at projects. So if you remember from last year, I talked about the CAR methodology. So 100% utility index score would be that brand new car just as you drive off the lot. But anytime you drive a car off the lot, the instant you drive the car off the lot, it loses its value. We have a decrease in the utility index score really as soon as we bring projects online. But the other end, that 0%, would be that 300,000 mile plus car that finally breaks down after years of use. And a 40% rating is that 150,000 mile car that is still reliable, but you have to start doing some major maintenance to keep it reliable. The overall goal is to continue to provide an excellent service to our customers, but stop the decline of the UCI score over time. Capital improvement projects take time to complete. There's definitely a study, design, and construction approach required for large-scale projects. Since 2019, we have been studying projects, and we've even started construction on a few of these major projects. The table identifies the managed decrease in the UCI score. We manage the decline by doing routine maintenance, changing the oil in your car, or as maybe Joe said, replacing the tires. But we also have to do larger work. It could be even things, before the car breaks down, it could even be as large as replacing an engine on a car. So you get into this large scale type of project. We've been focusing our efforts on areas 3, 7, and 8 on the table. And so we'll be talking about some of the transmission and storage tank projects later in the presentation. We'll also talk about projects in areas 1 and 2 in the presentation. The wastewater treatment, the water treatment facility projects are not driven by a UCI score, but other factors such as operational redundancy and regulatory requirements. Areas 1 and 2 are the types of projects like Joe was talking about, changing the tires to keep the car running, whereas areas 3 and 7 are those major work, replacing an engine, replacing a timing belt, that definitely takes a lot of effort. We also have started AIM scoring in the source water system. So we're currently in the middle of a 12-year replacement program of the Barker Gravity Pipeline System. You can see the decline in line 10 on this slide, but the project to replace the line has reduced the anticipated decline. And we anticipate this UCI to increase as we complete the replacement project. The source water storage category, line 11, also has decline, But this number is anticipated to increase after we complete the Albion Dam project, again highlighted a little bit later in the presentation. So in the wastewater system, we have not completed a full AIM study yet. Now, the current projects in the 2024 to 2029 CIP were identified in the current master plan as the highest priority or tier 1 projects. CIP identifies continuing work on the sewer lining program, replacement of the main sewer pipelines, and projects at the Water Resources Recovery Facility. A future AIM analysis will help us rank projects after the tier 1 projects are complete. That AIM scoring is going to aid us in that post-2029 capital improvements. And then specifically this slide here that shows the wastewater recovery facility, you can see several of the yellow and red areas identified in the figure are being added to the current CIP in conjunction with the phosphorus upgrade project of the Worth. The future AIM work will aid in determining which of the green projects on the slide we'll be addressing first. And then finally, I'd like to touch on the stormwater and flood utility, which it does not suit itself as easily to an AIM project as some of the other utilities. So that's where really the discussion earlier this evening that we're using the comprehensive and storm and flood analysis tool to help us move that project forward. So implementation of that CFS tool in conjunction with the stormwater master plan is helping to identify projects. So when we'll touch base a little bit more in that Upper Goose Creek project that even Joe discussed during the CFS tool discussion here in a little bit. And before we get into the projects themselves, I did want to touch base on cost escalation because we're certainly aware of the supply chain issues and inflation that are impacting projects really across the utility and really across the city. We're currently experiencing significant inflation rate increases. So to help balance that over the longer period of the CIP, we are applying an inflationary number to our capital projects from the time that we do get our initial estimates to look at when we're moving forward on our completion. We also balance individual projects based on their costs and need. For instance, we're moving forward with the projects identified in the table, and you can see where the cost escalations have occurred. And we compared these projects versus funding availability and benefits. The updated costs include our funding comparisons. For instance, we looked at on the clarifiers project there on the bottom. We looked at, because of where the costs were coming in, we did change the scope. We reduced the number of clarifiers within that project, but we still saw significant costs. We also changed timing with projects. The main sewer improvements project, we added a third phase into the CIP in 2029 to help defer some of those costs to be able to advance the vast majority of that project. But then we have also looked at funding on projects as well. So we'll talk a little bit later on the funding opportunities that we've had for the phosphorus upgrade project. So now we'll move on to a few of the specific projects within the current 6-year CIP. The list of projects on this slide are from the source water system, and just would like to highlight 2 of the projects. So the first one is the Albion Dam project, which is currently in year 2 of the 3-year construction. The photo on the slide identifies the work on the abutments. You can see the new concrete the workers are standing on, and the old concrete is behind the workers. And this project will seal the face of the dam. You can see the deterioration of that concrete that they've chipped off, and it also will seal a horizontal joint to help maintain and continue to maintain the life of this project. So after we're done with this project in 2024, it'll store approximately 1,000 acre-feet of water in that system, or in that dam. So, and to put it in context, 1,000 acre-feet, as I look things up, is about 500 Scott Carpenter Park swimming pools. So certainly a significant amount of water for that project. And the other one I wanted to just briefly touch on is the Barker Dam Rehabilitation Project, which has just been added to the CIP this year and scheduled for construction in 2029. It's a significant project that we're still defining the scope on. But we're in the process of working with the state engineer's office and a technical review board on the Barker Dam to look at where the current condition of the dam is and how it compares to current safety regulations. So there's definitely more to come on that, but we do anticipate that as a significant project later in CIP. And now I'd like to talk about some of the projects ongoing at the water treatment facilities. So water is delivered to the 63rd water treatment facility from the city's water supply from the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District on the western slope. And then the Patassa water treatment facility is supplied from the Boulder watershed west of Metro. The work at the 63rd and Patassa water treatment facilities replace aging infrastructure, address operational redundancy, and also address regulatory requirements. These projects increase the reliability of these two critical treatment facilities. And completing these projects allow the city to advance the water transmission main and tank projects in later years of the CIP by making sure we have the increase in the reliability of those facilities. So now touching base on the transmission, some of the transmission projects, and this is really the backbone of the water delivery system. So the transmission system receives water from the treatment facilities and then delivers water to the smaller pipes and eventually to the customers for their individual use. There's many miles of transmission piping slated for replacement in the coming years. The first of these projects is the start of a multi-phase project to replace the pipeline on 63rd from the 63rd water treatment facility to approximately Cherrydale. The project will replace aging pipe and upsize it to increase capacity within the system. This is the section of line that you can see marked as the 63rd in blue, just south of the diagonal highway or 119. Future phases of the 63rd project are identified in orange and pink. The second transmission pipe project that we're moving forward on is in the Table Mesa area connected to the Kohler tank. This project is currently in the design phase and scheduled for construction in 2025. These projects will allow the city to capitalize on two of the CIP decision-making variables discussed earlier. By changing the construction material in these pipes, it will decrease the consequence of failure if we do have an issue with these pipes, and upsizing the line capacity to increase capacity to our customers. Now I'd like to just touch base on the storage tank projects that are still in the later years of the CIP, but thinking the storage tank is really the buffer between the water treatment facilities and the transmission system. These tanks help manage changes in water demand over the course of a day, or also aiding in potential fire flow issues. These projects occur in later year in the CIP because they must follow the treatment plant work. And the reason we're doing that and phasing it this way is the storage tank project is a longer scale project and will be out for a longer period of time. So we need that redundancy within the treatment plants to be able to handle those longer term projects. Now I'm going to talk about some of the wastewater utility projects. Wastewater Master Plan has identified 4 Tier 1 priority projects for the major pipelines connecting to the WRF. These are large diameter pipes that collect the wastewater from the rest of the city and convey it to the wastewater recovery facility. We completed the baseline project identified in green in 2022. We plan to complete the other remaining sewer projects in the 2024 to 2029 CIP. The increased water line capacity from these projects will improve wastewater flow for the vast majority of the city. The major change from last year's discussion is that we have completed phase 1 of the main sewer improvement projects, identified in this section in green for that particular project, and have contracted to complete phase 2 of the project, which will begin construction later this year. I wanted to highlight phase 1 on the MSI project. Just wanted to show you results, you can see the lining of the pipe on the left in the before lining, and you can see the deteriorated concrete. You can even see some of the reinforcing material. Seeing reinforcing material on a concrete pipe is not a good thing. So we went through and accelerated that project, and you can see then on the right, the after lining photo. And what we did is we came in with a lining material. Basically, we blew up a balloon, cured that balloon in place, and now we have a structurally sound pipe within the pipe and with minimal reduction in capacity, but certainly we're able to get in and address those areas of concern quickly. And now I'd like to talk about the phosphorus project at the wharf. So this is a regulatory driven project and allows the city to capitalize on the voluntary incentive program offered by the state to reduce phosphorus from the wharf to Boulder Creek. The project will also opportunistically address aging infrastructure concerns with several areas of the wharf identified in the bill. We're currently working with the engineers and the contractor on this and the design team on the 90% construction plans. We anticipate finalizing pricing in the next few months with construction to start in late 2023. And now I'd like to pivot to a few projects in the stormwater and flood utility. These facilities are needed to help manage the stormwater and flood events as we discussed earlier this evening. The first project is the South Boulder Creek project. It's completed the 30% design and currently progressing with the 60% design. The construction estimate for the project is the same as last year at $63 million. I'll break that construction cost estimate down a little further in the next slide. Currently working on the 60% design. This design includes permitting and stakeholder coordination. Construction of the project is scheduled to begin in late 2024. So now looking at the cost on the South Boulder Creek design, as I mentioned, that 60% design is nearing its completion. In that 30% design, we did account for inflation and design changes. So there is room for cost adjustments within our current budget. We're also addressing funding issues in the storm and flood utility because in last year's CIP, this project was combined with the Upper Goose storm and floodwater projects. So what we've done is we decoupled those two from a bonding perspective. And that was more around the timing on how quickly we could advance the Upper Goose Creek project and delayed that one more, particularly with the mitigation plan that was just recently approved. But what that does is that helps with the city's bonding capacity in the storm and flood utility. And so we're looking to schedule that bonding in probably mid-2024, but that's really in conjunction with the construction approval process and the funding process. We can tie those two to this one specific project more closely. And now I'd like to just touch base on the Upper Goose Creek Stormwater and Flood Project. And this completes flood mitigation on one of the reaches of the recently approved mitigation plan for the Upper Goose Creek and 2 Mile Creek system. The other portion of the project upsizes and rehabilitates stormwater facilities in the upper portions of the Goose Creek drainage. These projects were identified as top priority projects in the 2016 Stormwater Master Plan. The projects are identified in the two figures to the right and are generally the ones that are circled in red. But we're still finalizing the exact projects within that. This and really a key with this project is that it identifies how stormwater, thinking the pipes in the system, and the flood projects, thinking the creeks, are interrelated and how we need to address improvements in this method. And then lastly, I would just like to touch base on a few projects that we're advancing in conjunction with other departments. Most of these projects are related to the storm and flood utility. So the list kind of shows some of those projects and just highlighting two aspects of that. And it's really related to this photo that shows the localized flooding in the Upper Goose Creek drainage from earlier this month. So in there is the Western City campus, which is in the upper right-hand portion of the project, and then also North Boulder Park, which is in the lower portion of this figure. And it just really, as we're moving these projects forward from a storm drainage perspective, but we're also working with parks in the North Boulder Park area, and then really the along with the city station on the western campus in the Alpine Balsam area. So with that is the discussion on the project. Now I'm going to hand it over to Chris DeVille to discuss some of the financial aspects.
And before Chris starts, I might want to just jump in for a second and acknowledge that we're quite a bit behind on time. Hopefully you're okay to keep going. We'll try to manage the pace a little bit, but we didn't have a main meeting, and it's one of the most important things the board does each year. So well, hopefully not that bad.
Thanks for that. So I've been introduced a few times, but for the record, Chris DeVille, Deputy Director of Operations. And yeah, appreciate your interest. And like Joe said, this is really important. So I have about 10 slides that I wanted to highlight. I have the fortune to deliver the news tonight, and consistent with Joe's message about Graham Clark. A lot of this is his material that he prepared, and but I had the privilege of working closely with Graham as a lot of our team. And so I certainly don't claim to have all of his knowledge and expertise here, but I think I can do an honorable job. If something comes up that we can address or I can't speak to, we'll absolutely find a way to circle back. Chris, are you okay to keep driving the slides for me? Okay. Just so we don't screen share and get caught into that. Okay. So as a reminder, last year we shared with RAB our 2-year plan for bonding to fund several large critical needs within the water and wastewater utility. And if you would allow me, I'm going to make sure I don't lose some of the essential information. It'll be a little less personal. I want to just make sure I hit all the highlights here, looking at my notes. So last year, as a reminder, and for education for Lauren, we did bond for $47 million, and that was achieved with this bond rating of AAA. So Standard & Poor's was able to give us that bond rating for, and I quote, Boulder's forward-looking capital plan to address firm water supply and aging infrastructure, long-term financial planning, cyber standards, as well as emergency response policies to strengthen systems risk resiliency. And that bond interest rate we got last year was 3.66%. So this year in fourth quarter, we do plan to bond for additional priority needs in water and wastewater. And the table on the slide here represents about $70 million in priority wastewater utility needs. And then the balance of about $20 million is in the water fund. So one item to note here, this figure of $91 million, it is significant, but it is actually less than the value we shared in the memo. In the memo, you might have read a value closer to $100 million or 99 million. The difference here is $8 million, which that's a placeholder for infrastructure upgrades related to the Spring Valley neighborhood, which is at the base of the foothills near Linden. So Spring Valley, they desire to annex into the city, and they've submitted an annexation application, and discussions and decisions are ongoing with the city and Spring Valley. There's still a lot of important aspects to discuss and sort out, but the concept that's moving forward that we wanted to share with you is that for the city to basically finance, be the bank for this annexation process, for the infrastructure improvements. But Spring Valley, the plan is that they will pay back all expenses for this activity. Of course, principal, interest, and any other related costs such as consultants, contractors, et cetera. So it's a little bit of an interesting way to go here, and still lots to be discussed, but that's the reason for the difference. So the costs for Spring Valley were recently included in that fourth quarter bond preliminary estimate, but really due to uncertainty with the details and timing, those costs have now been removed from what you're seeing tonight. And the final decisions will be made about Spring Valley independent of this table and these priorities. Essentially, this bond and these priorities need to continue. There's too much ambiguity right now about Spring Valley. So just wanted to clarify that. One last comment on bonding. It's due to the enterprise fund status and framework established under the state of Colorado. So water and wastewater bonds can be issued together, but bond funding for needs in the stormwater and flood utility must be separate from water and wastewater and cannot be commingled. So that's a statute provision we're under here. Next slide, Chris. Thank you. So as we move over to rates, I'll note that in last year's financial planning, our 2024 projections at that time included a 6% water rate increase, a 5% wastewater increase, and we showed you a 12% stormwater flood utility increase. So the rates before you tonight are higher in water and wastewater and lower in the storm flood utility for 2024. The main reason behind the higher recommended rates for water and wastewater is really inflationary pressures, the costs we're seeing for our projects. The main reason behind the reduced rate in storm and flood is, as Chris mentioned earlier, decoupling the Upper Goose work from the South Boulder Creek bond. That gives us an ability to smooth out those rates further. That takes that 12% increase that we calculated as necessary down to the 10%. So that's the main driver there. All right, next slide, Chris. We've shown you this in the past. We still think it's relevant. This is just an example of our, typical single-family residential customer in the bill impact.
One back.
One back on the screen. There you go.
There we go. Thank you. So as you'll see here, we're calculating right around $10 per month as a bill impact, which is about 8.4% over their current bill for a single-family residential customer. So anticipating a question, you may inquire, did you have this $10 target and work the CIP to drive towards that? No. The team did conduct a series of detailed sessions internally to really wrestle with and determine priorities with the metrics and criteria that Chris shared, establishing critical needs within each fund in each utility area. And then that work was ultimately combined. And that's the CIP, the 6-year CIP that was shown and shared tonight. So the rates were calculated to obtain the necessary revenue to advance this work. And it just happened to fall right around $10 a month. Other customer classes like multifamily and commercial, we anticipate the rate increase percentages to be near this 8.4%, but not exactly. And in July, if desired, we can share some more specifics on some of those important customers. Next slide, Chris. Okay, I'll turn into funding. Yeah, sorry, I got to advance. All right. So at the request of RAB, and we've heard this over the years, utilities has really taken serious the ability to seek out alternative funding with discernment and discretion. We don't chase every opportunity, but we really do try to be mindful of where we can have a high probability of obtaining some funding assistance. And so we are in the process of applying for federally funded low interest loans that are made available through the state revolving fund program. Previously, our municipal bond rate really outcompeted the SRF, but recently we've become aware that the SRF is really an attractive option for us currently. So this longstanding program that finances design and construction of water and wastewater infrastructure, it's administered by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and the Department of Local Affairs, or DOLA, and lastly, also the Colorado Water Resources and Power Development Authority. So the bipartisan infrastructure law of 2021 effectively replenished this funding. And the city did initially submit for 3 projects last year. And so based on the high level of interest for this funding and competition from other entities, not just Boulder, the board did decide to limit the number of eligible projects to 1 per fund. And they also determined a cap of $18 million for wastewater projects. So after careful consideration, the city staff did decided to pursue the SRF loan for the phosphorus upgrades project that you've been hearing about. So up to $3 million of the 18 is eligible for even a lower interest rate through what is called a green project reserve. And this reserve fund directs some of this funding, this SRF program funding, to projects that include sustainable components, including elements like water efficiency, green infrastructure, and energy efficiency. And the good news is the city has received approval for this reserve due to the low energy treatment approach that is planning to be used in the phosphorus upgrades project. And so we will be taking advantage of this $3 million additional reduction in loan percentage. The city will be finding out in August how much of the additional funding we're able to obtain, the balance of the $15 million, and what the actual interest rates are. The last bit of information here is, pending all these decisions, the last bit of information we'll learn is the amount of loan forgiveness. So they have identified up to $1.5 million in actual loan forgiveness. So cumulatively, this is a very good story, and we're excited to be receiving this news, and the team has worked hard to bring this forward in the interest of our community. And just to note here, Graham did the calculations. This green project reserve award is anticipated to save about $700,000 over the 20-year funding cycle. So real tangible benefits for us. Just a quick note here on the billing assistance programs. We believe this is important to lift up. The photo you see in the background, we just thought we'd have a fun moment. This is the city's first reservoir, built in 1875, known as City Reservoir Number 1. So it's located near modern day People's Crossing Park, west of Pearl and kind of adjacent. So anyways, just a flashback for old time's sake. So regarding the billing assistance, we did want to just mention we're using a targeted approach that allows us to assist those who need it while still generating the revenue through rate increases to keep up with the vast needs that we have in the utility. So as a reminder, the city did receive $400,000 in ARPA funding, and we've spent a little over half of that right now reimbursing customers in need. So now the last series of slides, I'll try to go quick here. Gordon, we credit you with some pre-conversation about your interest in fund financials, and do agree that maybe the rest of the board would benefit from kind of a fund financial 101. So I'll kind of hit this quickly. We tend to focus on the CIP tables and the projects, but the fund financials are really what matters, and how we can assure that we're able to pay for all of this. So the overall balance sheets are fairly simple math to understand. And we have a fund balance we start with. We have additional revenue that's identified, and then we have all the uses. And we basically have a fund balance before reserves. And that fund balance before reserves becomes the next year's starting fund balance, essentially, right? And our overarching bottom line here is that we can set a reserve amount, but the ending fund balance after reserves has to be positive. So that's really the guiding mantra here. So on these next three slides, I'll just try to step through a few highlights that maybe you weren't privy to or didn't understand previously. So I'm going to use the water fund as an example. I'm looking at 2024 specifically. So we have a beginning fund balance of about $47 million. So the biggest source of revenue is our monthly customer billing. So you see that represented here at $36 million. The line called projected rate increase, so that's additional revenue, assuming that the recommended rate increases are approved by City Council eventually. And so that's shown here representing an extra $3 million in revenue. Then the next largest category here is what we refer to as the plant investment fees, or the PIFs. So that's shown here a little further down at $3.4 million. Really, those are development fees, either development or annexation. And that's for these new customers, new folks, to pay for their portion of the built infrastructure in the city. So they're really buying into this the great system we have here. And then at the very bottom, we have a row for bond proceeds. So you can see in 2022, we have $32 million listed. And then in 2023, we have $18 million listed. That's anticipating proceeds for the fourth quarter bond that we plan to do here. And then in 2024, there's nothing listed. We don't anticipate bond proceeds in the water fund in 2024. That's why that's planned. Next slide, Chris. So these are our uses or basic expenditures. We have four major categories: operating, debt, transfers, and capital. So everything from our day-to-day expenses, and then again, representing all of our debt, our existing bonds that we're already paying back. And then we do see a new line item here with anticipation of starting to pay back the fourth quarter 2023 bond in 2024 with a new line item. So that's shown here as a $1.4 million new debt service starting next year. Transfers, these are for internal service support. There's a row titled cost allocation. So that's really all of our important internal services like information technology, HR. It's basically all the support that we need to run a utility, but these are folks living in other departments. So this is our utilities portion of paying for that. And then the capital item here should match verbatim the 6-year capital CIP value that's shown in the CIP tables. Last one, so reserves. So again, I mentioned we have the ending fund balance before reserves, so 29 million, and then we have a bunch of reserves listed out here. So we can maybe just leave these for questions. We can talk through any of these as needed. And then we have a final fund balance after reserves. So our assumption here is that in any given year, we could spend all of these reserves. And that's our attitude and our approach. Fortunately, most years we don't spend any of them. They really are to be touched only when needed, only for these dedicated uses. You may ask, well, why do we have any money left? Why not drive the ending fund balance down to zero? And the real answer for that is through a strategic plan over time, we need to build up a fund balance. So then our individual year rate increase isn't overly significant. We've mentioned this in the past. We try to smooth out the rate increases. And if we drove the fund balance to zero every year, we would have to really spike an individual year's rate increase. So we think that's the wise and proper way to go. So that's it. We're going to turn it back over to you for questions. And did want to emphasize we have Kevin Clark, Stephen Groders, Chris Olson, and Brandon Coleman ready to help if we have some specific program or project questions that Chris or I can't answer. So,
and before the board members jump in, I might just say, long presentation, longer meeting than normally we're done almost every month. So appreciate you bearing with us. This is an important vote and important conversation with. This is the one where we really want to get your feedback and have a good idea of where you stand on the CIP and come back next month and ask. So if you have major concerns or issues with what we're proposing, it would be great to hear what those are.
Any questions from the board?
Just do we have any, what kind of information is there available from like the AWWA or something like that in terms of comparable rate increase numbers for cities that are similar or, similar age of infrastructure, similar demographics or whatever? I mean, how do we kind of stack up? I think I saw in the S&P thing that they indicated that we might be a little bit above. How do we kind of stack up vis-a-vis our peers?
Yeah. I don't have any fresh or current survey data or benchmarking data for you, Steve, or the board, but I believe that when we've done that, we find we're generally in the middle. Some communities definitely tend to go low on rates any given year, but then have to have the spikes like we commented on just a few moments ago. So that's a generic answer, but if you'd like a more recent peer survey, we could potentially follow up with that.
And we did do some of that, Steve, in last year's presentation, I believe, and we were in that upper middle range, and certainly share more of that information. I don't think we have an update from last year's numbers as that in that comparison.
And we do pay attention to how we track versus various cost indices and inflation. And we're trending reasonably well with that. And we try to look, I mean, we've got the AIM project where we really get into the minutia of our systems and evaluate the asset management perspective and bring that into this. We also look big picture and are trying to learn from others in the industry of like, for a city of our age, what should we be reinvesting in our infrastructure each year, and kind of have some checks and balances that way.
That is useful information, though, to see, where are we tracking relative to our peers as we, suggest or recommend these types of rate increases, and then what are our average residential household rates and how do they stack up to our peers? And then also that idea of the incremental annual rate increases, and are we higher, lower, kind of tracking with the norms? So just as a kind of piece of contextual information that could be helpful in future years or.
Okay. Thanks for those comments. I know often in July, we will show where Boulder is on the range in terms of like the dollar amount for the bills. We can do that again, of course, and I believe prepared to do that, but specifically to this comment about the rate increases specifically. We can try to bring some of that information forward. I do have a recent table of the construction cost index, which we tend to look at and benchmark from occasionally. So last year for 2022, if I'm looking at the right value for Denver area, 7.2% was the individual year construction cost index for the Denver Boulder area.
And you mentioned that you're now escalating to time of expenditure for your capital improvement projects. Now I was wondering what that escalation is that you're applying. Is it next 5 years, a certain amount, and then it changes, or is it just?
And at this point, across all utilities in the CIP, we're applying 4% annual cost inflation factor. And really, that's even what Chris was talking about just here recently is, in the last few years, we've seen some significant spikes, but then it's normalizing over the last 12 years. It's more along the lines of about a 3% rate increase over the last 4 years, but you've seen a significant jump in the last few. So we're trying to normalize that a little bit, and how much projects are going to cost us in that same concept when normalize your increases too.
It's the highest annual percentage increase we've ever done.
Actually have some values I can share. I know looking at wastewater fund more recently, it looks like, in 2015 post flood, we did a 30% rate increase in wastewater. And then 1 year, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, we ended up with a 75% rate increase for the storm flood utility. And for a single year. That warrants some explanation. So that was after the 2013 flood. And the realization that our wastewater collection system was taking in a bunch of rainwater, pressurizing the system, and we had sewer backups. And we actually went through this very budget process with RAB and City Council. And there were just so many concerns about the flood issues and the effects on the wastewater system that council asked us, well, this doesn't seem like a high enough increase, and they asked us to come back with something significantly.
And probably at that time, the stormwater annual or monthly fee was very low, so.
Yes. Proportionally, for sure. That's not something we expect to repeat frequently. Maybe a quick screen share. This is slightly outdated by a few years, but it speaks to the general question. This is the wastewater utility only, and this is a longer range, 30-year trend.
of where the rate increases have gone. So this is showing twice in 20 years, we had a 0% rate increase, or excuse me, in 30 years. And then the 30% I mentioned, we had back-to-back 20% rate increases in the 2005, 2006 timeframe. So yeah, just an example. We have trends and summaries like this for all three utilities, if that's of interest.
Yeah, and I'm looking for an okay button.
Did I break your button?
Is it the center one? The big center?
Shuts down. Sitting too much.
There you go. Yep, got it.
2 or 3 times.
That's one way to end a meeting.
No more questions, right?
I had a clarifying question from some of the cost tables that are in our packet for the water fund. And Karen, I don't know if you can pull that out. Information packet. Or Chris.
That give me a moment here.
We're looking at the CIP or the fund financial, Gordon?
Of the CIP. It was actually on page PDF page 12 of 25. It's one of the questions. I'll wait till Chris pulls that out if we can find it.
Yes, this is the CIP document, so you're on page 12. Speed scrolling. And at the water fund financials?
No, the table below that.
Table below, okay, on the CIP itself, okay.
At the bottom of the table. Yes, the treated water transmission system study and R&R program, 14 million. Could you describe what?
Correct, that 14 million is that 63rd Street pipeline replacement project that I talked about earlier in the discussion. That's really coming from the diagonal highway to about J Road along 63rd. And that. And really what this is from the transmission studies, you can see along all of that is the advancement of what is the significant transmission, the larger pipe upsizing projects. So we're trying to start advancing those projects consistently the next portions of the CIP. So you'll see numbers similar to what's in that line item for quite a while.
Yes, I was just looking for a correlation of terminology of names.
R&R stands for rehabilitation.
Replacement, correct.
And if I could just note that. Sorry. Yeah, no, this is really important. The word studies in here because this is just by title trying to tie it back to the 2019 transmission study. That was a really intense, significant effort that evaluated and then determined the priorities from a system perspective. Now this is implementation.
Just as a suggestion to avoid other confusion like I had, you may want to actually call it something like 63rd Street Pipeline, because that's how you described it in the narrative. You know, just for about an easier way to correlate.
And certainly if I were to, in our working spreadsheet, expand that for several projects related to all of those numbers, we're trying to really at this point, it's really starting a transmission replacement program. And work from main work, but certainly we can upgrade the title like express.
Or conversely, in the narrative text that precedes the tables, put that in parentheses somehow. So that might be the easiest way to go.
Certainly can do that.
Likewise, then on the next page of this CIP, about the middle of the page, under the source water reservoirs and raw water facilities, Parker Water System for this year, 19.2 million. I noticed in the executive summary in the narrative on page 5, it said the Barker Dam Outlet Works rehab would be 13 million in 2024, but this says 19.
And that's again, it's a combined because there's also in that category it's the Barker Dam work plus the Barker Dam pipeline work. So as you look at even and then in the presentation, we really lumped several projects in there because there's the Barker Dam Outlet Works, which is the 13 million, and then roughly this $5 million a year to continue our work on the Barker Gravity pipeline from Barker Reservoir to Tassel Plant. And then you've got what is a large spike in 28, 29, which is that Barker Dam rehabilitation program. So it's that, how do we present and summarize in a table versus transferring information? Can I add some more clarity there?
I noticed that I appreciated the financials 101. And I know that you talked about keeping that enterprise fund above, in the black so that you can help with some of those rate shocks. But that fund in the next 6 years is for most of, for water and wastewater, stormwater is going down. And in the recent credit rating, there was reference to how some of these investments may be putting strain on the financials for the city. And so I just wondered about any strategies or thoughts that staff had on, this, of course, maybe a question for Grant Park, but just as that enterprise fund is decreasing a bit.
That'd be a great question for.
Yeah, sorry.
No, yeah, and I think I do understand the spirit of it. So I've been with the city now for 15 years, and I think I've seen this trend of the fund balance accumulating, going up, and then kind of ebbing and then flowing down, and this kind of intentional oscillation and this dance between the major bonds, the appropriate rate swinging, and just, always keeping that bottom balance above zero. I think with the stated reserves that are listed here, and again, happy to answer any questions on specific line items, there's been the feeling like we have enough, we're managing the risk, and we're within our financial guidance that either central budget or outside entities would have strong feelings about. But would welcome different perspective if you have some insights that we haven't heard.
And certainly, Amy, looking at this one here is pulling up the fund financial in the water system. And Chris didn't go into its details, but you look in 2026, we do see a low point in that fund financial. So we're again trying to balance projects, balance rate increases to not have that
borrowings
and balance borrowing as well. And so that's that ebb and flow that we're trying to continue to work through. Certainly from a borrowing perspective, it's where we go on this end. This, again, another Graham perspective is that ratio of our operating expenses to our debt and trying to maintain that number, whereas the storm flood utility has in some of the older bonds has a limit to that. Whereas we're above, and that's 1.5 to that. And the water and wastewater funds are actually significantly higher than that. So we have more, we could go advance more on borrowing capacity to keep those numbers up. So
coverage is very high.
Correct.
All of that is something that we pay really close attention to and expect our lead financial person in utilities to pay close attention to. We do have two positions that support that part of it. And so we can also follow up and go back and look at the specifics, but the natural up and down, that is part of the strategic planning. Just how bonds come into play. We can come back with more detail.
I know the city's updating its water efficiency plan this year, all the new conservation programs. Does that come into play in this discussion in terms of future revenue? Do we expect significant changes in revenue because of that, or curious if what that discussion's like?
I might take a before that, Joe, that definitely looking at the conservation program and thinking of adding to the expenditures to help things like turf replacements for the community and things like that. And between the efficiency plan goals and some of our other water policy discussions, it is entirely possible that we could avoid some major capital improvements in the future, which is where, and I think as the efficiency plan gets detailed out, we're gonna have some of that financial information in there for you to look at. And I could see that coming forward and being more visible in next year's. One other just companion comment that I think is relevant, John and board, is I think looking over the years, our ratio of the volumetric charges versus the fixed charges was significantly swayed towards the sale of water volumetric charges. We have not, made them equivalent, but we've been discussing and making small changes such that there is a larger fixed charge and less of a dependence on the volumetric charges, just as a more modern best practice to not be so dependent on just the sale of water. Which is a factor in a wet year like this, it's turning on your sprinklers. And so other city departments are under financial pressure when there's a recession or something. Ours is more driven by precipitation patterns. And part of the reason we have established some of the reserves that you saw is to be able to manage those ups and downs.
A specific project question, if that's okay. So the Goose Creek Upper 2 Mile Canyon Creek plan that we approved at City Council voted for, the total was 44 million. And this, I know in here is stormwater and flood, and I saw that breakdown, that was 12 million flood and the 13 million, I think, stormwater. So I was just curious how those connect. It looks like Reach 6 is that part of the flood, but is Reach 1 and 2 also the part of the flood mitigation plan? Or
Reach 1 and 2 is not a part of that Upper Goose Creek project. So Reach 1 is related to work around North Boulder Park, and then Reach 2 is related to work around the Western Campus in the Alpine Balsam area. So we're looking at as really the Alpine Balsam work, and both of those are more tied to the those interdepartmental projects that we were discussing. And so that's where that funding gets driven more by those projects than specifically out of the storm flood utility at this point. We have a component that goes into it, but it's not the focus of the current CIP project.
so you'd have to come back later to do the flood mitigation components of Reach 1 and 2.
Or we would do those right now, or doing Reach 2 in conjunction with the Alpine Balsam project. So they're having to do that, call it, as the city being the developer is having to put those facilities in as a part of that greater facility project. For Reach 1 is certainly something that we're still evaluating where the right place to fit it in. We might have to come back later and address that Reach 1 project as a part of more of the CFS priority.
Yeah, if I can support what Chris just said, it was a fine point, and Brandon and Vicky had so much to cover, they didn't get to this, but in your memo, there was actually the list of 36 reaches. There was a double asterisk flagged, and so Goose 1 and 2 did obtain that, like Chris just mentioned, because of these other strong departmental drivers. Those are likely to get some attention and progress, kind of out of sequence of just the utilities view if that other work wasn't going on. So, but I guess to answer, at least what I heard is the initial comment, John, about the $44 million Upper Goose value. And that is for Upper Goose 1 through 6, if it was done as one whole project. But I guess sharing here tonight, and one takeaway is, because of circumstance, and we tend to agree with it, Upper Goose doesn't feel like it's going to be one whole project. It feels like it might be phased and segmented.
That's correct.
A series of questions also on the stormwater especially for 2024. I don't want to monopolize the floor to people other questions. Maybe I'll ask a few, then you guys can dovetail in. If you wouldn't mind bringing up the spreadsheet, our meeting packet again.
Fund financial packet.
Yes, the CIP part of it. Yeah, that was it.
There we go.
Yeah, one, 2 more pages.
And down on the specific. There we go.
Page 19, there you go, yeah. So the vast majority, almost all of the 2024 budget request is for the South Boulder Creek project and associated costs. And so my first questions are, where did the $51 million come from?
The $51 million is the flood project portion of the South Boulder Creek project.
Just the flood.
Where would one find that number?
That is in the 30% design information is based out of that. And then the other component is this $12 million, which we're calling the land acquisition or the mitigation portion of the project. So that's combined where in the summary information, we brought them both into the current price of $63 million. And I certainly can break out that 12 million if you'd like me to, like we did in the presentation.
Yes, that'd be
so that, and I can pull up on the presentation, but we've got 4 million of that is for some earthwork, and then we have an additional 3 million for purchase of what is the open space other land, which is that's the 119 acres from the CU South annexation agreement. And then there's an additional $5 million for the restoration work that needs to be done for that land purchase. So that's where we get the $12 million in what is land acquisition and mitigation.
Thank you for that. In the 30% design report, there's a line item for, I think, environmental restoration, and that number is $3.5 million.
And maybe I'm going to hand that one over to Brandon if he's online.
I didn't see him. Or that could be a follow-up. You could. Yeah, that's follow-up.
Oh, and it looks like Brandon is here. Brandon, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sure. Yeah, so the 3 million of environmental restoration that's included in the cost estimate for the project is based strictly on federal environmental mitigation offset ratios. And then the additional environmental restoration is for restoration of the OSO to meet the Open Space Board of Trustees request for disposal with that agreement. So they are 2 separate tasks and not being double counted.
Thank you, Brandon. And so the $63 million shown of those 2 line items is recommended for approval in 2024. I'm curious, what is the status? I'm aware that there are a number of both federal and state permits that are required to be approved by those agencies. And so what is the status of those permits in terms of this 2024 timeline?
Got it. And Brendan, I'm going to go ahead and hand you back. They're in progress, and the timing is in conjunction with the financial implications. But Brendan, I'll talk a little more detail on that.
Sure. Yeah, we've been working with the Army Corps of Engineers for our 404 clean water permit. And through that process, we consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So we've had a preliminary meeting with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and are getting ready to submit our draft biological assessment to the Corps to be submitted to Fish and Wildlife. We've also submitted for a special use permit with CDOT and have had it's called a field inspection review meeting with CDOT. So around the 30% design stage. So we've gotten the initial comments from CDOT as well. And then the intent would be After the completion of our 60% design, we would submit to Boulder County, City of Boulder, and also FEMA for our floodplain development permits. And that'd be a CLOMER conditional letter of map revision with FEMA, and then just a floodplain development permit with the city and also Boulder County.
I would add to what Brandon said, that this is the part of the utility that I started my career in, managing these projects. And for a project that's this far out, I think we're reasonably well positioned for the permits and the approvals that we need. So I assume that might be what's behind the questions. How much risk is there that there be a delay of that nature? And we will carefully monitor that as we continue to move forward. But right now, things are looking decent.
Well, thank you for that context. Actually, my questions were going in a slightly different direction. And if you wouldn't mind pulling up that schedule again, just so we can kind of look at the columns of each year. From what I understand, the proposed schedule is that the permits would be approved and the construction would start late in 2024. I think you might have even mentioned that in your. Yes. And so I'm wondering, in terms of the timing on that, it seems like if the schedule holds, the construction and the cost needed, the bond needed to pay for the construction, not much of that would probably be needed in 2024. And so I'm wondering if requesting this entire bond amount isn't premature for 2024, and if it would make more sense to split it into some amount in 2024 and then maybe the bulk of it in 2025. One line of thinking on that is the schedule. If there are delays, and I know that since you can't share funds from the stormwater enterprise to the other ones, it sort of starts the clock ticking in 2024. And if there are delays, unexpected delays, that might potentially affect your ability to spend the money. But then secondly, this number is based on the 30% design, which is a conceptual level design. So there's a reasonable amount of uncertainty in that number. And I'm aware that from the schedule that the 60% design report is coming out this fall sometime. And I understand that the cost estimates will be much more refined at that time. And so that would be a second reason to consider breaking this bond amount into 2 years. Because this year we could recommend a certain amount that would certainly cover the remainder of the engineering fees, the design fees, and some amount of construction if it were to occur. But then a second bond, we'd have much more accurate numbers upon which to estimate. Because more than likely, because of cost escalations, even though I understand that you have factored that in to your cost estimate, chances are that it won't be a $63 million cost. It'll be something not that, and more likely it'll be more. And so if we were to recommend approval for this right now, it seems quite possible that you'd have to come back at a later time to ask for more bond money to sort of fill up the rest of what will be the cost at that time. So hence another reason to consider breaking it into 2 parts at this juncture.
So I might want to jump in on that, and Chris don't have the benefit of the conversation I had with Graham on Friday about this, and he reminded me that it has been our practice when we do major capital improvement projects and we go out to bid, the contractors find it really important that you have all of the money in hand. And so that has been our practice. We're planning it that way. As we get closer to the timing, if the schedule should slip or something, we could delay sale of the bonds to give ourselves the maximum benefit for the time window that we have to complete a bonded project under. And then the other thing I would say, and invite others to weigh in, is that as we go through the design process and our designs get further refined, there's a contingency that's built in for unknown things. And that is much larger at a lesser scale of design completion. So 30% design, it might be a 40% contingency or something like that. When it gets to 60%, we know more, we have it detailed out further. So it might drop down to 25%. And then when we get to the 90% and getting ready to bid, it goes down to 10 or 15%. And so the overall numbers, I mean, they can and they do change, and there's things out of our control like inflation, but in theory, we're accounting for that as we go.
And then, and really some other points, Gordon, where you had talked about to be able to get us through that process. We've actually already allocated the funds for the design portion of the project. That was completed in previous CIPs. So we're comfortable in moving forward with that aspect to where it does allow us to think about a bond. Right now, what is the plan later in the year with the end of 2024 construction timeframe? Then it's late third quarter, early fourth quarter to looking at the bonding. So we have that timing and flexibility to come back and related to if we do see some cost changes.
I'm not trying to follow you.
But so looking at starting construction December of 2024. Right now, as we're not looking at early 2024 of going out and doing our bond, any of our bond work. So we're planning on tying the bond timing to happen just ahead of that construction schedule. So if we were to encounter some delays, we have some flexibility on that too. And also there is additional bonding capacity within the utility since it's a standalone utility. By that, we talked about earlier decoupling of South Boulder Creek from the Upper Goose Creek and 2 Mile project that we're going to have to bond now for the 2026 construction. So we have flexibility, and I think that's probably the bigger message with where that funding comes from. So we put together a good plan and we can adjust as if need be.
And I understand then the timing on the first line item there, the 51 million for the flood project. How about the timing on the land acquisition mitigation? It seems like that would occur towards the end of construction. And so again, I'm thinking, would there be a way to push that off? Because ultimately where I'm going with this is the $67 million, the bottom line here on this table, represents a pretty healthy amount to bond. And that undoubtedly has some bearing on the stormwater flood rate increase for this coming year. And so I'm thinking if there's a way to split part of that, to delay part of that into later years, it would reduce the bond for this year and presumably then lower the need for such a high rate increase this year.
So I can jump in on that as well. And we're working through the project schedule, and some of those acquisitions are university assets that will change hands to the city, like land and water rights. And so that is anticipated to occur at the time that we have all of the approvals and we're ready to go to bid. And some of the permitting agencies require us to demonstrate that we own the land and have rights to it. So there's really not flexibility in that timing. It's a good suggestion, but probably not one that we can realistically entertain.
Although, well, that's the 4 million of the 12. I understand that, right? No, it's 3 million of the 12. And so it looks like roughly 9 million of the 12 would be earthwork and restoration work, which wouldn't happen right away, I would imagine.
And that earthwork component really is tied into the early stages on the construction on getting there. So there certainly is in some of those restoration dollars happening earlier in the contract. And again, it's just on the philosophy of, as we can, is securing the funds at the time of bidding for that surety and comfort on the contracting community. It's really the general approach and for the project.
Yeah, I'd like to just put a point on that. The restoration and the excavation, fill, whatever it is, those are components of the construction. We don't I mean, that needs to be part of the money that we have in hand when we start the project. We don't break it out like that and phase it like that.
I'm just mindful of the stormwater utility rate increases in each of the last 3 years have been 12%, and this year's proposed is 10. So that really starts to add up. And even though I've been an advocate and proponent of rate increases, so we can catch up on our infrastructure and even stormwater flood mitigation efforts, it's just feeling like that's a cumulative high cost, and I'm just seeking ways if we can lower that amount of cost for this year. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, for sure. We're thinking about that too, and we're trying to balance that with the VEPS needs and the master plan that went through last year. The message there was, again, one of the themes was do more, fund more, do it faster. And really it's a rare master plan where the vision plan funding there was an appetite for it. So it's a balancing act that we all have to do. One other comment I'll make that's, I think, related to the theme of what's on the table is we saw the list that was 36, individual items. But I don't think any of us think we're going to do 36 separate projects because a lot of those will circumstantially probably be grouped or organized such that, we'll mobilize and combine them, and there'll be a lesser number of projects overall. I think that's some assumption there, even though we haven't really done that work yet. It's just the reality of how it would likely go. So we're hoping to start stepping our way through that, and the needs are there. The point we made in the memo but didn't reinforce tonight is there are other drainages that we do not have mitigation plans for yet. So as the mapping gets done and mitigation plans gets done, there will be other needs jumping on that list. So just to reinforce, the needs are vast. So it's not just that list of 36. There's actually other needs that are not represented because of the fact that we don't have a mitigation plan.
Other questions from the board?
You go through the details of each of the 36. No.
That was the threshold. We should order the pizza.
I have another question then. Stepping off of this table, I believe in our April meeting, or perhaps the May non-meeting, it must have been the April meeting. The information packet we got indicated that there was a plan to hire 5 full-time equivalents in the utilities, and I don't remember which enterprise it was, so I apologize for that. But my question is, where would we see the 5 FTEs in the financials? Or how could we deduce like, aha, this went up because 5 FTEs are being added?
I don't know if that granularity would be shown here in the fund financials. So just for total transparency, and in the fund financials, under the use of funds category and the operating subcategory, I mean, that's where salaries and benefits are included. Yeah, but that's in operating, and again, going back to the original discussion tonight, and one of the questions that was asked, that operating is not part of RAB's purview. It's the CIP and the capital projects. But happy to answer questions if it will. Chris and I think, stumbled on to the specific answer though. Page 17 of the memo, under operating, like we just discussed, there is a line item for new flood team.
Yeah, new flood team.
So I think that speaks to the 5 FTEs in the flood crew to do increased maintenance of the flood and drainage areas. Yeah, that's this. There's more to that, and we actually found funds that we didn't need to use going forward in the future to pay for some of that. So it's not necessarily an increase. Every time we add an FTE, we sometimes just reprioritize.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board?
No.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe and Chris and Brandon by phone for allowing us to like so much people on this tonight.
For sure, and it is a lot to digest, and kind of because of the new Juneteenth holiday, we end up with a compressed time frame between June and July. So would offer that if the board members would like one-on-one meetings with us to go over, if you're wrestling with anything, happy to do that. Happy to talk about the schedule of the July meeting. If we need to bump it a week, we could consider that. Although then it gets into board member availability, and chances are the whole house of cards falls. So whatever we need to do to be responsive to the board's needs. Ideally, we would be looking for a positive vote from you on the CIP. So if you don't feel like you have the information and have concerns, let's continue to discuss it.
And so are you suggesting, Joe, that those discussions should occur prior to the July meeting?
They can, if you just need more, you want to dig more into the details. If you're struggling to understand any of the detail, reach out and we'd be happy to talk with you. Of course, we want to be transparent and provide all the information to the public as well. And we could summarize that in the July meeting if needed.
Well, with that, then I'd like to conclude this agenda item. And thank you all for your time and diligence, all your prep work. It really showed. We move on now to the next agenda item, which is matters from the board. Any matters from the board you'd like to raise? I had several, but because of the hour, I'll only bring up two. One of them is the status of the funds for the turf grass removal program. There was an article in the Daily Camera not too long ago talking about the turf grass removal, non-essential grass,
Non-essential turf.
non-essential turf, and the funds were available or potential. Just curious about the status on that. If those funds are still available to the public.
Yeah, there is information on the website about those programs, and there is funding available. There's not a ton, and it typically gets sought after and used up quickly. I do know that has been recently enhanced by state funds. I can't remember the dollar value.
20 additional projects.
Yeah. And so I recall that I replied to an email that a customer had that had been sent to RAB not too long ago. I'll see if I can find that because it explained the.
Yeah. And then the other item I would like to bring up briefly is I'm sure you all got this, the newsletter from the utility department, first one I've ever seen. And I just wanted to acknowledge what a really great publication this is. I thought it covered all the key elements in exactly the right kind of style for the public, the right level of language and detail. The graphics were great. This was just really a first-class publication.
So appreciate that feedback. And I know sometimes the board members can have questions of whether you're adding value. That mailer is a direct result of suggestions from the board in past years during retreats and things like that. And we've taken that to heart and probably wouldn't have come up with that on our own. So you all can pat yourselves on the back or some of your past board members on the back for that as well. Graham was one of the key authors to that as well. So I think that was his mic drop moment. Yeah. Thanks for that, Gordon.
I think that concludes matters from the board. So now matters from the staff.
And usually I have a handful of things because of the CIP focus tonight. I really don't. I was going to bring up the mailer and I wasn't sure if you had all received it, so that would have been on my list, but I don't really have anything and would be happy to move to future schedule if you'd like.
When was that mailed out? I haven't seen it.
Pretty recently, within the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I think it was also delivered electronically, if I'm remembering right, for people that have their bills electronic. We have extra copies if you'd like one, or missed it somehow.
Our daughter dumped ours in the sink, so that. So there's an extra copy floating around.
Okay, yeah, there's probably some implied feedback there. We need a laminated version?
Yeah.
That'd be great. Yeah. So the big thing coming up will be board action on the capital improvement program in July. And then we have an action item for an IGA intergovernmental agreement for the Keep It Clean partnership with the county. That's a recurring thing that just comes up and requires board action and council action from time to time. Shouldn't be a really time-intensive one. Then in August, we would anticipate not having a meeting again, and I missed September. Apologies that got cut off. But in September, we would be looking at bringing to you the water efficiency plan. For a board look at that. So a fair amount coming up for the board to chew on.
Yes, and with the timing on when new members come on board, this is always really a hard time. For board members.
It's a hard time, and I think that's partly the way why the boards are designed the way they are, with new member coming on and 5 total members. And if it was all on Lauren, that'd be too much to ask.
Shut up to see it, it's fine.
Well, if that's it, our final agenda item is adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second? All in favor of adjourning? It's like it's unanimous to adjourn. Once again, thanks to staff for a really great presentation, and all those who didn't get a chance to speak tonight but who were available. Really appreciate your time also.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate you sticking with us for a longer than usual meeting.